Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the PsychedelX Finale event. My name is Emily. Just a little background on myself. I will be moderating this panel. I'm a mycelium and co-founder of the Intercollegiate Psychedelics Network, of which this event is a part of. I'm also a PhD student at Penn, where I study immune microbe interactions in the gut, but also really interested in psychedelics just for fun. And so yeah, welcome again. If you're interested in being a part of IPN and you're a student or youth under 30, we have a bunch of community events, a lot of Discord activity, and you would definitely have a great time. So definitely please apply. I'll plug in the link later. And so basically how this event will go down, I'll just give a brief summary of what psychedelics has been so far. We're going to listen, of course, to the top 6 speakers. It'll be the top 3 undergraduate and the top 3 graduate students that the psychedelics team has selected for you guys to watch. And then we'll give some time for the judges to deliberate to pick their top undergrad and graduate student. And during this time, we'll announce the People's Choice Award winner, which we'll get into a little bit later. And after that, the judges will tell us who their winners are. And the prizes for the winners include things like bragging rights to say that you won the first psychedelics event, a short animation of their talk, and an invitation to Gage's podcast. So Gage is a member of our psychedelics team. He has this really cool podcast called Quirky Science that you guys should check out, and a few more here and there. So as always, ask questions or comments in the chat, and please be respectful of our panelists here today. And yeah, so overview of psychedelics, it's a student talk competition with over 20 students who hopefully you saw a few of their talks on YouTube. It's really a process. So we've been with these students for about 7 weeks, given them workshops on how to give a talk, how to package their ideas. They've been matched up with peer mentors, put into talk teams to practice their talks. And so it's really been a long iterative process to get to know each other and to also just improve our science communication, which is so important nowadays. So watch out for our fireside chat, where we hope to talk more about how this process went, some strengths and weaknesses in a few weeks. And so without further ado, I would like to introduce or give a chance for the judges to introduce themselves. I know a few of them you've seen before, but if you guys could just go ahead and unmute yourselves, maybe we can go by like alphabetical order and by last name.
Does that put me first?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So I'm Manoj Das. I'm a postdoc at Johns Hopkins at the Center for Psychedelic and Conscious Research. And I work with brain imaging and cognition, different cognitive paradigms to look at the effects of psychedelics acutely, as well as their enduring effects.
Cool, I guess I'm next. I guess Victor is not going to introduce himself because he would be first, right? Or
oh yeah, sorry. So it is a combination of our panelists here. It's a combination of judges and the top 6 students and then some IPNers. So you would be.
Okay, cool. So my name is Manesh. Currently a PhD student at McGill University over here in Montreal. On the psychedelic front, I've collaborated a lot with Robin Carhart-Harris and others over at the Imperial College Centre for London Psychedelic Research Center. And I'm a neuroimaging researcher, so I've done research looking at, well, I'm currently doing research that's research comparing LSD versus psilocybin versus DMT in terms of fMRI brain imaging. And I have a couple other projects there looking at just the brain mechanisms underlying psychedelic drugs, and also mechanisms underlying kind of changes that occur after having psychedelically assisted psychotherapy. And you might also know me from my YouTube channel, The Psychedelic Scientist, where I provide easy to understand content on the latest in psychedelic science. Yeah, I guess that's it for me.
Very cool.
Is it me?
Taylor, yes.
Hi, I'm Taylor, and I'm a postdoc with Imperial College at the Center for Psychedelic Research. And in particular, My research focuses on the acute and long-term effects of psilocybin on the brain and psychology of healthy participants that have no previous psychedelic experience. So we're using a range of psychological assessments, behavioral assessments, and neuroimaging techniques.
Let's see, am I next? I guess so. I'm Tom
Yes.
Roberts. I've written and edited half a dozen or so books about psychedelics. I'm particularly interested in trying to get people in the liberal arts, humanities, and religion to see the possibilities that the fields have for psychedelics. My best work is my writing, but I'm best known for starting Bicycle Day.
My name is Ismail, or Is for short. I'm the CEO of Quantified Citizen, and Quantified Citizen is a startup in Canada. It's a mobile health research platform for democratizing the research process, and we're starting in psychedelics. And one of our business partners is Paul Stamets, and we are just completing our probably the world's largest psychedelic study, a 12,000 person microdosing study on cognitive performance and mental health. And we just submitted our first paper for publication. There's 4 more on the way. We're working on a number of other psychedelic research projects with the underground community, and through a initiative called the Psychedelic Data Project, which IPN is part of. So I can say more about that later, but it's a fun opportunity to get involved for young people, I think, as well.
All right, thanks everyone, and congratulations on the paper. So now we'll move on to the talks. So the talks basically will be just around 20 minutes, and we'll give 5 minutes for feedback and Q&A from both the judges and attendees. So the attendees should be able to just post in the chat and actually upvote questions if you ask in the Q&A. So we'll go off based off who gets the most upvotes for those types of questions. So we'll start with the undergrad portion and then the graduate portion. So in the undergrad, we have Caitlin Thompson, who is actually in Bali, Indonesia right now. So it's like 4 a.m. her time. So she did pre-record her talk. And if Isla could just share that with us, and we'll just listen.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Caitlin Thompson, and I am an independent psychedelic researcher, a microbiome expert, and probiotic manufacturer. And this is my presentation on the psychedelic microbiome. So how did I get here to a place where I'm talking about a bunch of bacteria that live in our guts and psychedelic drugs? Well, I got here by doing something that very few people actually successfully do, which is heal from a chronic autoimmune condition and achieve remission. So for most of my life, probably the first 27 years, I was riddled with all these different horrible disease symptoms, and I didn't even realize. So I had symptoms of Lyme disease, depression, anxiety, I had chronic fatigue, pain, food allergies, skin problems, PTSD, and a compromised immune system, but I didn't even realize it. And psychedelics were actually a really important part of me waking up and figuring out that I had all these issues. So I'm going to share a very short story about how I came to where I am today. So when I was in my undergraduate degree studying neurobiology, I was pretty heavily invested in having a lot of psychedelic experiences. So I was going to festivals, I was going to Burning Man, I was traveling to Peru and drinking ayahuasca. So I was doing a lot of psychedelic exploration. And what I didn't realize was that the psychedelics that I was using in all these various experiences that I was having were actually helping me heal and mitigating a lot of these symptoms. So when I got into the last year or so of my undergraduate degree, my classes got a little bit trickier, organic chemistry, biochemistry, calculus, things that are kind of hard. So I decided to take a little bit of a step back from partying and just focus on school and finishing my degree. And what I've discovered on accident was that every 7 to 8 weeks or so after my last psychedelic experience, I would start to chemically and mentally unravel. I would become increasingly anxious and depressed and mentally scattered, even though nothing was changing circumstantially in my life. And this happened like clockwork every 7 to 8 week mark after my last psychedelic experience. So what I realized was that I actually had all these weird things wrong with me, but I had been effectively mitigating them with psychedelic drugs, completely unbeknownst to me. And this led me to asking more questions about why am I experiencing these symptoms and these conditions. And that led me through the rabbit hole of the scientific literature on the microbiome. And I had to become a microbiome expert to actually solve the puzzle of my own body. So the human microbiome is basically a term to describe all of the microorganisms that live inside of us that help us function in our physiological processes. So it turns out that you're actually less you than you realized. And bacteria outnumber our cells 10 to 1. So for every human cell inside of you, there are 10 bacteria cells also living inside of you. They even outnumber us in the quantity of DNA material that they contain by 150 times the amount. So gut bacteria are actually super fundamental for dictating our states of health and controlling disease outcomes for us. They modulate our immune system, they regulate inflammatory processes, they influence our metabolism and how we digest and process nutrients from our food. They affect our stress response and even our brain function and mood. So the microbiome is made up of all sorts of different species and characters, as I like to call them. And just like any community, you have these different sort of quirks to these different characters. They have different strengths, they have different weaknesses, they like different things, they behave differently, and they're unique individuals, just like human beings. In the community, you need diversity. You need the teachers, you need the plumbers, you need the farmers, you need the technicians, the babysitters, and the pizza delivery boys in order for a community to harmoniously work together and be self-sustaining. So when a certain type of bacteria grows too big and crowds out other bacteria, this can actually result in species dying and being lost, which reduces the diversity of gut bacteria. And when this imbalance of gut bacteria populations happens, it's called a gut dysbiosis. And gut dysbiosis has been strongly implicated in the development of a number of different diseases, including autoimmune conditions, diabetes, depression, anxiety, neurodegenerative diseases, skin conditions, and even things like schizophrenia and certain cancers. So the discovery of the microbiome and its relationship to our brain has revolutionized the field of psychiatry, because now we see how actually integrated the neurons are from our peripheral nervous system with our gut. So this is called the enteric nervous system. And there's actually more neurons in your gut than there are in your spinal cord, just to give you some perspective of the density of neuron tissue that's integrated into your internal organs. And in 1937, there was a molecule called enteramine that was discovered in the guts of rabbits. And later, 10 years or so, this same molecule was discovered in brain matter and was actually given a different name, and it was called serotonin. Now, for some reason, the term serotonin stuck, whereas enteramine kind of got forgotten, even though that was the original description of it. And serotonin since then has been thought of and classified as a neurotransmitter, but it turns out it's actually an important player in normal gut function. So 90% of your serotonin is actually in your gut. That's where most of the serotonin activity is happening. And 60% of the supply of serotonin in your body is actually made by bacteria. It's not made by your body. So there's this really interesting thing where if you wipe out all of the gut bacteria in a rat or a mouse, which is called a germ-free mouse, it actually substantially changes the behavior of the mouse or the rat, in part by actually wiping out their ability to produce serotonin. Now, you can actually restore their microbiomes, and their serotonin activity and normal behavior patterns will resume. So there's some really interesting research that they've done on fecal matter transplants, which is basically when you take the microbiome or the poop pretty much of one rat and put it into another rat. So some of the research has looked at if you take a diseased rat, say a rat with diabetes or obesity or with depression-like behaviors, and you take its microbiome and transplant it into a healthy rat, the healthy rat will actually start showing symptoms of being a diseased rat. Now, alternatively, you actually can take the microbiome of a healthy rat and transplant it into a diseased rat, and oftentimes that diseased rat will actually reverse their disease state or the behaviors or symptoms associated with having that disease. So it's super fascinating the influence on our health and our disease state that these microbiomes can have, and we can actually change the state of our health by manipulating the microbiome. So this has become super interesting for medical research in exploring the potential of fecal matter transplants in humans. So psychedelics. Psychedelics are making a comeback. They're kind of like that nerdy kid in high school that you thought was kind of weird, but then they come to the 10-year high school reunion and it turns out that they're actually super hot and successful now. Yeah, that's what psychedelics are doing. And there's been a lot of exploration recently in use of psychedelics in assisting psychotherapy, especially for post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, obsessive compulsive disorder, eating disorders, and anxiety. But psychedelics also show potential for being treatments for pain, autoimmune conditions, and even cognitive decline. And of course, we are also very excited about the exploration of psychedelics for spirituality, emotional healing, and performance enhancement, especially in the microdosing world. So one common feature of the classic psychedelic drugs is that they all seem to share the binding property of interacting with a very certain type of serotonin receptor called the 5-HT2A receptor. Now, if you look on the top left here, you see serotonin. This is our endogenous neurotransmitter that we create that's important for all sorts of things: mood, cognition, sleep, appetite. And if you look at all these other psychedelic compounds, they share a chemical structure similarity as serotonin. And because of this, they're able to fit into serotonin receptors and mimic the activity of serotonin in a way that binds all of these into having some common mechanism at this 5-HT2A receptor. Okay, whoa. This lady is jumping around. She's talking about some crazy stuff, bacteria and then psychedelics. How is this all connected? Well, so the connection between bacteria and psychedelics is that they interact with our body's serotonin system to alter our states of consciousness. That's the connection here. And that is where I see these two fields of study synergizing and creating some really interesting parallels between them. So what happens when you give bacteria psychedelic drugs? Do they die? Do they flourish? Do they change their behavior? Do they quit their job and decide to live in a monastery? The truth is, we don't even know why bacteria have serotonin as a byproduct of their metabolism. We don't know what they're using it for exactly, but there is some evidence that they use it as a signaling molecule. And some research suggests that it's important for bacterial survival. So when you treat certain types of gut bacteria with serotonin, they actually will proliferate and increase in abundance. Now, there's also proteins, homologous proteins in bacteria that are very similar in structure to SERT, which is the serotonin transporter protein found in humans. And it's possible that this homologous protein is able to transport serotonin into bacteria cells. So if that's the case, my question is, could this homologous protein also be able to transport psychedelic drugs that are serotonin analogs? So the vagus nerve, this is sort of the epicenter of exploring the indirect effects of gut bacteria. Now, I'm not talking about the fear and loathing in Las vagus nerve. That's different. The vagus nerve is a thick nerve that goes from the brain and goes down into the internal organs, specifically the intestines. And it's a two-way street. So the vagus nerve is important for taking information from the brain to the gut, and also from the gut to the brain. And the brain function, it has a lot of impact on our gut environment through the vagus nerve. And the vagus nerve can influence things like changes in secretion of gastric juices, which affect the pH of our gut, or gut motility and how quickly food is moving through, all of which are going to influence what type of organisms can live there and thrive. Alternatively, changes in the gut microbiome, for example, from food that you eat, can also change your brain function through manipulating neurotransmitter production, regulation of inflammatory pathways, extracting nutrients from your food that are important for keeping your neurons functioning. And it is a two-way street. So the brain and the gut are always actively communicating between each other. So the vagus nerve really helps us understand something that's been a bit intuitive to a lot of people for a long time, and it's that there is a relationship between trauma and stress and our physical health. And this provides a very physiological explanation for how this happens. So in some research where they look at adverse childhood experiences as a way of measuring trauma, we see that these ACEs, as they call them, are linked to microbiome-related disease outcomes, especially autoimmune conditions and other chronic illnesses. And this is because there are downstream effects on the microbiome through the vagus nerve when we experience stress and trauma. So when we're having a stressful experience, our body is more preoccupied with running from the lion that's chasing us and this short-term survival thinking. It's shutting down digestion, it's shutting down the immune system, because those are not important functions for the immediate survival of an organism in a stressful state. So psychedelics, because they're so useful for resolving emotional pain and trauma, there's likely this relationship between improving the stress response with psychedelics and the outcome of our gut microbiomes. So could psychedelics possibly be helping us change our microbiome indirectly through psychosomatic or spiritual effects via the vagus nerve? And if psychedelics are directly or indirectly changing our microbiomes, what does that mean for medicine, for therapy, or even for the existing paradigms that we see as our sense of self. And this sort of started to beg bigger questions. When I think about, for example, the immune system, which is one of the most crucial parts of our systems that the microbiome influences, the immune system is really the body's ability to distinguish between the self and the other. So the fact that microbiome bacteria are so important for dictating the body's sense of self and other really says a lot about what the sense of self really is. And I started to ask myself, if the state of our microbiome can dramatically affect our mood, our personality, and even the story that we tell around the things that happen in our lives, then who are we? If a dynamic conglomerate of organisms can craft such fundamental parts of who we are, then who are we? And are we a single identity with an ego? Or is our consciousness and sense of self a result of a Gaian type collective consciousness that's facilitated by a we rather than a me? Are we as humans also part of a collective network of organisms creating an emergent consciousness? And what can we learn from understanding ourselves and nature through this different paradigm? How can we take this idea and use it to harmonize better with ourselves, each other, and our planet? So I'll end with a little story. Once upon a time in a jungle far, far away, I was at an ayahuasca retreat, and I decided to have a conversation with my gut microbiome. And it was in the height of my autoimmune illness. And I asked them, please, can we all just get along and create harmony between each other? Because I am a vessel for your existence. And if you hurt me, then I can't continue to provide a home for you to thrive and to exist. And after asking my gut bacteria to find peace with each other, I felt a distinct feeling of being received. I felt like I had been heard, acknowledged, and a sense of peace came over me as I finally felt that all versions of myself were finally integrated as one. Thank you.
Well, I thought that was a great talk. Because she's not here, unfortunately, maybe we can move on to the next one, but please plug in Q&As. And I'm also just gonna plug in her review that she just came out with on autoimmune disorders, because I am planning on using it as well. And it's very related to this talk. So yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed that first talk. Next is Sophia. So Sophia, will you unmute, and you should have screen sharing abilities.
Yep, I do not.
Okay, you should be good now. Sorry about that.
No worries. Can folks see this?
Yes.
All right, perfect. So hello, everyone. My name is Sophia. I'm currently a junior at Stanford University, and today I'm going to be talking about one way that we can think about characterizing psilocybin therapy and why it's important to think about that question at all. So I want to start by reading 5 quotes for you all. And while I read them, I want you to think about what might be causing people to say these things, what are times in your life that you felt similar things, and are these feelings that broadly we should be encouraging or discouraging in our daily lives? So you really enter a state of bliss. It was more than just pure relaxation, it was a healing. I let the experience take me where it wants to take me. I felt more relaxed than I ever thought possible, and it felt whole and complete and at peace. So I primed you a little bit and that I told you that I was going to be talking about psilocybin therapy. And if you have any familiarity with psilocybin or psychedelic mushrooms, you might know that they're often associated with feelings of letting go and of connectedness, like what the people in those quotes were talking about. So if you thought that those people were under the influence of psilocybin, you would be correct for 2 out of the 5 quotes. The other 3, however, are taken directly from Yelp reviews for this massage business called Verde Touch that's located in the Bay Area. So why am I starting here? Why am I starting with a comparison between psilocybin therapy and a massage? Well, there's a couple of reasons. First of all, I think there's this very common tendency to talk about psychedelic medicine and psychedelic movement with very dramatic, kind of grandiose language. We see that here in these headlines. Words like great power, great responsibility, revolution, can psychedelics save the planet? And this is not at all to say that psychedelics aren't an extremely promising field. I wouldn't be giving this presentation if I didn't think that too. But I think there's an often underappreciated power in taking a step back and looking at this research through a more objective and familiar and maybe even mundane lens. And so I hope that the comparison between psilocybin and a massage can help you take on a little bit of that perspective, whether your feelings about psychedelics are very positive or even very negative as well. I also bring up a massage because I want to introduce this very specific type of therapeutic model. And to do that, I'm going to start by just going through a couple of reasons that I can think of why someone might decide to book a massage at a massage business. So one thing that I could think of is that you've just had a really long week. You had a ton of deadlines due. It's been super stressful. And so you want to give yourself a little reward. And so you decide to go get a massage. You might also work a job where you have to sit in the same chair for 8 hours a day, just looking at a screen. And so your back hurts real bad by the end of the week, and you think that a massage might help with that pain. You might also, for example, be a professional athlete. If that's the case, then how well your body is functioning is very important to your job. And so you found that a massage's ability to reduce muscle tension, to reduce inflammation, helps you do your job better. And then finally, you might be someone with chronic pain. So there's nothing that physicians have found that makes your pain go away completely, but over years of trying to manage your symptoms, you found that getting a massage semi-regularly helps you to feel better and go about your daily life. And so the reason I go through all of those different things is because I want to argue that there are many different initial motivations that someone might have to go get a massage. And in all of those cases, a massage is something that ultimately makes you feel better. And the key part that I want to kind of set up here is that a massage is able to help people with all of those different situations for the same reason. So whether you have chronic pain or whether you just have a really bad week, going to get a massage helps to make you feel more relaxed, take some time to slow down, to just be with yourself. It also has kind of the physical properties of reducing inflammation and muscle tension. And as such, it's able to help you feel better. This is important because in this talk, I'm going to be arguing that psilocybin therapy is acting in a very similar way. So to give you some background, psilocybin therapy, which is giving participants or patients psilocybin in conjunction with psychotherapy, has shown efficacy for a variety of different diagnoses: OCD, anxiety, depression, anxiety, and end-stage cancer, drug dependence for multiple different drugs. And what I'm going to be arguing is that the reason it's able to reduce symptoms for all of those different diagnoses, and maybe for people without a specific diagnosis as well, is because it's able to broadly improve well-being in a way that is helpful for all people, whether they have a specific condition or not. So before I get into that, I want to just go through some brief background information. First of all, I want to clarify what I mean when I talk about psilocybin or psilocybin therapy for the rest of this presentation. And what I mean is that most of this research, unless I explicitly say otherwise, is coming from published papers in peer-reviewed journals. So in all of these cases, psilocybin is being administered to participants who go to a specific place, receive a specific dose, are monitored for a specific amount of time with a psychotherapist present. And here again, we can see some parallels to this idea of a massage, where you would go to a business and a masseuse would work with you, you would pick a specific treatment. And what it boils down to is essentially limited use and highly monitored settings. This isn't the only way that people use psilocybin, but it's the only way that I'll be considering for the purpose of this presentation. I also just want to briefly go over how I'm going to approach this question. You'll recall the question is psilocybin therapy able to help people because it acts with a broad mechanism of action that generally increases well-being such that people with and without conditions are able to benefit from it? And those benefits come from this, single mechanism. So there's two ways that I can think of to approach it. The first is to look at effects beyond symptom reduction. So these are cases where people with a specific condition that they're trying to treat are given psilocybin therapy, but the effects of psilocybin therapy seem to extend beyond what we would expect if it was just treating that specific condition. And then the other case are situations where psilocybin is given to controls. So people who aren't trying to treat a specific illness. And in those cases, we can look at whether the experience that controls have is similar to the experience that people with a specific diagnosis have, and also just if it seems broadly beneficial for controls. So we'll start with this idea of beyond symptom reduction. And specifically, I want to start with this qualitative study that was published in 2017. In this study, people with treatment-resistant depression were given psilocybin therapy, and then interviews were conducted to get an idea of their experiences. This graph is not based on real numbers. No quantitative data was collected in this study, but I made it to help illustrate a really important point. So this darker purple arrow represents depression symptoms. These people have treatment-resistant depression, so symptoms start high, and we can see that after psilocybin therapy is given, there's kind of a steep drop-off in symptoms. It looks like the people's depression is getting better. But then for some participants, depression symptoms start increasing again, so they relapse. But what we see is that this lighter purple arrow, which represents increases in well-being as measured through positive changes and perspective and behavior according to participant interviews, we see that that arrow is consistently increasing. So if psilocybin therapy was just treating depression, then we would expect that this well-being, which would be a byproduct of improved depression, would go down once the depression symptoms come back. However, according to these interviews, we don't see that. We see that people continue to report improved well-being despite their symptoms coming back. And so that's one indication that maybe psilocybin therapy isn't treating the depression specifically. The other thing we can look at are cases where psilocybin therapy actually seems to be treating depression or anxiety so well that the improvements we see are beyond what we would expect if it was just treating the psychiatric condition. So you can think here about, for example, someone who has major depressive disorder and is given an SSRI as a treatment. We might deem that that SSRI is effective if the participant says things like they found it easier to get out of bed in the morning, or they found themselves enjoying activities that they didn't enjoy previously. In contrast, when people are given psilocybin therapy for depression, we see quotes like these on the left, that it expanded their mental space, broke their mental shackles, gave them a holiday away from the prison of their brain. So these are much broader, grander statements than someone who was treated with a different type of psychiatric medication, which is one indication that maybe psilocybin therapy is doing more or acting in a different way than those other treatments. We also see in qualitative studies, these broad themes emerge of increased sense of interconnectedness, new perspectives, a new sense of identity, and a new sense of empowerment. And these are certainly very positive things that we are seeing and positive changes, but I would argue they're positive changes that anyone would benefit from, not just someone with clinically diagnosed depression or anxiety. And so seeing these very profound mindset and lifestyle changes is another indication that maybe psilocybin therapy is just broadly increasing well-being, giving people a better sense of their identity, a greater sense of empowerment, and then it's those changes that allow people to then better confront their diagnosis and the symptoms associated with that, but that would also be helpful for people who don't have those symptoms that they're dealing with. And then the final point we can think about in terms of this beyond symptom reduction is this idea of transdiagnostic applicability. This is something you hear about a lot in the psychedelic medicine world. The basic idea is that you have the single input psilocybin therapy that then leads to improvements for a variety of different diagnoses. And so what that tells you is that psilocybin therapy is acting with a very broad mechanism of action. It's doing something upstream of all of these specific diagnoses such that it's able to elicit effects, beneficial effects for all of them. And one really helpful analogy that I think is useful here is to think about something like healthy eating. So if I, for example, just wasn't feeling great, I was felt overwhelmed, I wasn't sleeping well, I had anxiety, I might go to my primary care physician and just see if they had any advice, anything to tell me. And they might ask me about my diet. And if it turns out my diet is not great, I'm not, not eating a lot of vegetables, getting takeout a lot, that kind of thing, they might advise that I change that. And if I start eating healthier, I might find that my sleep improves and my anxiety symptoms get better. But in that case, I don't think we would say that healthy eating is a treatment for anxiety. Rather, we would just say that healthy eating is a positive lifestyle change that makes people feel better in general and that allowed me to confront some of those other challenges in my life. So what I'm arguing is that psilocybin therapy is acting in the same way as healthy eating, as this broadly beneficial thing that people can utilize to then help them better confront other challenges in their life, whatever those might be. All right, so I went too far. All right, so now we're going to move into the section on the effects of psilocybin therapy in controls, so people without a specific diagnosis. So recall the question we're trying to get at is psilocybin therapy a treatment that through a single mechanism broadly improves well-being in a way that is helpful for people with a specific diagnosis and for just people going through their life? So one way we can look at that is to look at a case where psilocybin therapy is given to people who are explicitly trying to treat a certain diagnosis and just people generally, and see if their experiences are similar. And if they are, that might suggest that there's this common mechanism of action and this common thing going on. So that's what this slide is looking at. We have this case where healthy controls are given psilocybin in a qualitative study, and then also people with anxiety associated with a cancer diagnosis are given psilocybin. And we see these broad themes emerge that are all quite similar. So we have this idea of rapid onset of effects, this idea of a sense of surrender or letting go, these qualities of a mystical experience, which we can think of as this idea of ineffability. So you feel like you can't describe it, but you also feel like you learned something very profound, like this great truth from the experience. And then also ideas of a changing self or a new view on how you fit into the world around you. So the fact that we see these common themes emerge for people who had a specific goal of this treatment to treat their anxiety and just people generally suggests that maybe psilocybin therapy is doing something very similar for both of these groups. We can also, perhaps in a more straightforward manner, just look at the changes in controls and see if psilocybin therapy given to people without a specific diagnosis is something beneficial. And so here are some statistics that indicate that it is. In one study, 2/3 of participants reported that their psilocybin therapy experience was one of the top 5 most meaningful experiences of their life. Within that kind of cohort, around 10% said it was the most meaningful experience of their life. In that same study, about 80% of people said that their experience with psilocybin increased their well-being and life satisfaction. And then about 72% of people described their experience in a way that met the criteria for a mystical experience, which again is this idea of ineffability, so being unable to describe it. Noetic quality is what William James called this kind of profound truth. And then also this idea of transient, so it doesn't last forever, it's a distinct moment. And then also the sense of passivity, so something coming over you. So these are all things that made people's lives better or more meaningful. I also want to draw some attention here to potential negative changes in controls. These are perhaps more important when psilocybin therapy is given to people without a specific diagnosis, because then we're less willing to accept potential risk because they're not trying to make a certain symptom decrease. So I do want to point out that in one of those studies where psilocybin was given to controls, all of the participants, 15 out of 15, reported some anxiety prior to the onset of the drug's effects. And then 2 out of 15 reported that that anxiety continued into their experience with the drug. So this is a small sample size and it's only 2 out of 15 people, but I do want to point out that this is not necessarily a wholly comfortable experience for people. And then the statistic on the right does require a little bit of context. So this is not a case where psilocybin therapy was administered in a controlled setting. This is actually a survey of individuals who self-identified as having a bad trip. And then when asked to respond specifically about their worst bad trip, around 40% of them said that that experience was one of the top 5 most challenging experiences of their life. So we don't know what this number would look like if psilocybin therapy was administered in that therapeutic model that I talked about earlier, but it is worth noting that there's a non-zero chance that psilocybin therapy psilocybin can lead to very difficult moments for people, and that's important to acknowledge too. All right, So that's my evidence for why I think that based on existing research, we can argue that psilocybin therapy is acting with this broad mechanism that increases well-being for all people and that then can help reduce symptoms for specific diagnoses, and then also can just help people broadly in their lives. So I want to spend the last few minutes talking about why this question matters, why it's important to talk about this in general. And to do that, I want to talk about just different ways that medicine and its purpose can be considered. So here we have the old medical model, so kind of historically what medicine was meant to do. And that's this idea that you go to your doctor because you have a specific problem, you receive treatment for that problem, and then you go on your way, you fix a specific issue. So that would be, say, I break my leg, I go to the doctor, they give me a cast, eventually my leg is healed and I'm on my way. I've fixed that specific issue that I presented with. What we're maybe moving towards in the medical world is this lower model where treatments are more broadly just increasing a person's general health, allowing them to better handle existing medical conditions and also be better equipped for medical problems that happen, that they might confront in the future. So we can think about this in the context of chronic illness when there is no treatment that could specifically make your problem go away and return you to exactly the same health situation you had before that issue. But there are things that you can do to help increase other areas of well-being to make you feel better. Then we can also think about it in terms of preventative medicine. So things like diet, mindfulness, exercise. So things that just broadly improve your health and allow you to better confront challenges in the future. So if you buy the argument that I've set out today to prove, which is that psilocybin is acting with this broad mechanism of action that increases well-being for all people, then psilocybin therapy should fall into this latter category, a treatment that broadly increases general health. But there's a problem because unlike something like exercise or healthy eating, which is kind of just there for the taking for all people, psilocybin therapy is not. There's legal guidelines that dictate that some people don't have access to it. And so that's a problem because we have this therapy that seems like it's beneficial for this very large amount of people, but not a very large amount of people can access it. And how do we fix that issue? Well, there's kind of two extremes. You could go the legalization route and say that everyone should have access to psilocybin therapy. But then by situating it outside of this medical space, there might be people who really need this, people with severe psychiatric conditions who, because there's no chance of insurance coverage or something like that, because it's not a medical treatment, won't be able to afford the treatment and therefore won't be able to get its benefits. But then if you go on the other extreme of saying, okay, we'll do clinical trials and we'll take that route to legalize psilocybin therapy for specific medical diagnoses, then you're never going to be able to do enough research for everyone's unique situation, especially if it is something that can help all people regardless of their what they're going through in life. So there'll still be a lot of people who could benefit from this treatment who aren't getting it. And what this really gets into are these broad questions that medicine is always grappling with about who should get access to treatment, about what a treatment even really is, and who gets to make those decisions about who deserves something and who doesn't. And I don't have answers to these questions, but I want you to think about this presentation as much about psilocybin therapy as it is about our medical system and the limitations that come up when we have such strict categories of what is medicine and what isn't, and when those categories have very broad repercussions for who can have access to different things. And so I think part of what makes the psychedelic medicine movement so intriguing is because it really calls on people in the medical community to start looking at these gray areas and this ambiguity and figuring out how psilocybin therapy and other psychedelic therapies can best fit into our medical system in a way that allows the most people possible to benefit from them and use them to live healthier and more fulfilling lives. Thank you.
Great job, Sophia. I'll open it up to the judges to ask any questions or give any feedback.
So I guess I'm a bit confused as to what, well-being, how this is, it seems just kind of like a kitchen sink of everything else that's not whatever you care about, for example, depression, that it seems like kind of like a really homogeneous construct for across different disorders in many ways. I guess if I would just be curious to Yeah, if you could speak about that more, about why this should be considered as opposed I don't know what it is, I guess. Yeah, a little bit.
Yeah, I think part of it is because it's blurry in my head, and where this talk came from was initially I was trying to give a talk about is psilocybin therapy medicine or is it something else? And like, is it specifically treating an illness, like you have this like hole in your well-being and it's filling it in, or is it just something that is helpful and maybe people with depression need that help more because they start with this case of reduced well-being that is interrupting their functioning. And what happened was I couldn't find a good definition of like what medicine is to even use as a starting off point and an argument. So I think it came out of this broader question of where do we, like, who decides that and how do we draw the line of like, this is a medical treatment and this is something like a massage, which is available to everyone, but might be useful for people with their medical needs. And so I think part of why that like idea of well-being is blurry is because I'm still trying to figure out what that means to me and how to conceptualize it. But I think the broader point I was thinking at is my experience with psychedelic medicine, my interest is very founded in the medical side of things, and that it's like purely from an academic standpoint and in academic labs where you're really thinking about how does it treat this specific condition. And I was getting a little bit lost in, I guess, just thinking about like the benefits that we see seem like they could help people without a condition too. And how does that affect how we should think about this compound, and how does it affect who should get access to it and in what means?
Sophia, I wonder if this would be a helpful way to think about it. We recognize that there are vitamins and trace minerals that we take every day for our physical health. We might think of psilocybin as being like a trace mineral, but for our mental health. Now, why we would take maybe every day or once a week or whatever it would be, I think that would be the path to go, to see it as a diet supplement, not necessarily as a medicine. And in both cases, if you're missing, let's say, a lot of vitamin C, there are medical problems that occur. And that can be solved by giving the vitamin C. Or if a trace mineral is missing, supplying that mineral gets rid of that problem. And to think that way about mental health and psychedelics as being, ought to be investigated as a sense of trace minerals for our mental health.
Yeah, I think that is a very powerful example. And a lot of what I have found helpful in working through it myself is trying to draw from things that already exist in our life, like vitamins, and how we can kind of use that as a bridge to get at these questions that maybe are a little bit less familiar.
Hi, Sophia. Great talk. I have a quick question just about the parallels that you were drawing with a massage. Can you just go over that again? I was a bit confused as to what the connection was there with that one.
Sure. So there's two, I think, that I think of. One is just the specific the way that psilocybin was delivered, and that there's people can take it in like more of a recreational setting, less controlled. And then there's also the way that it's often delivered in like clinical studies where you would go to like a specific place and there would be a psychotherapist on present and you would receive a specific dose. And so that's, in my mind, similar to a massage in that you could just be at home and ask your friend to give you a massage, and it might be a very relaxing experience, but you wouldn't necessarily expect the same benefits as if you went to a massage business where you can look up the reviews and like look up the credentials of the masseuse and look at the treatment that they're providing and see what it's supposed to be, useful for. So there's that argument. And then also I was trying to think about kind of the vitamins might actually be a better argument, but I think it's a similar thing of something that can be very useful for people with a specific medical need, but also can just be a very useful thing for people who are going through their daily life and maybe like feeling tired. Not that like tired is necessarily the parallel, but just something that you do need to go to a specific place to do, like you're not just doing it at home, but that is also not entirely confined to medical spheres, but can be useful for people with medical conditions.
Thank you.
Hey, Sophia. Yeah, awesome presentation. I mean, just like a comment for me for what I would have been happy to see would be diving more into like the psychological mechanisms that could give rise to improvements in well-being, right? Because you kind of made it seem like you go through psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy and you just output well-being and this well-being happens, right? But of course, there's a whole set of psychological mechanisms, things that people can go through that give rise to well-being in its various dimensions, right? And it's that measure of well-being is kind of orthogonal to improvements in symptoms, which, you know, it's, I guess, an open question on to what degree they're correlated. It'd be cool, you know, to look more into what does well-being really mean and how do they get to the well-being and how do those mechanisms, how are they conducive to a particular type of well-being that's kind of different than being over your depression, for example, right? I feel like those are the questions that were in my head after your talk.
Yeah, I think that's really important too when you get into, which I didn't focus a lot on, but when you're talking about like the issue of maybe negative changes in controls, is that there's also this kind of flip side where working, it's not as easy as just like doing something and then output well-being. Like there's a lot of work on the side of the participant that goes in often. So yeah, definitely with more time and more research, I think it's important to address those kind of nuances in the actual process. And I think that leads to a lot of new questions and new things to think about for sure.
Have you tied your work into the?
Yeah, good talk.
No, go ahead.
Okay, sure. I was just going to say, yeah, great talk. And I'm curious where you're going to take this. And so it's a little less on the talk itself, but a little bit more. I'm kind of curious, what are the next steps for you in terms of research in this area? Are you interested in going further with this? And if so, what are the kinds of questions you want to answer with these your focus of research?
Yeah, so I'm right now interested in med school as like a further goal, and the way that this kind of topic has fit into that often is just thinking about I'm also really interested in kind of placebo as like a treatment and those kinds of questions of like how I think a lot of issues with our medical system have to do with how strict we are with like this is helpful and this isn't helpful and this is a treatment and this isn't treatment. And I think especially with psychiatric illness, it can be really important to be able to accept some of this ambiguity and some of these issues of like, we know that this is helpful to people and we might not know specifically how yet, but like we do know that it makes people's symptoms better, and that should be appreciated. And also just greater focus on the experiences of the patient versus kind of viewing the patient as like I think a lot of times it's just their experience and their narrative is kind of lost in the medical process. And so I think those ideas are a lot of what I hope to take into medicine. And then also obviously just psychedelics it seems so promising now for mental illness specifically, and maybe for more aspects of medicine.
Sophia, have you tied this into the work that positive affect boosts the immune system? And with this, the mystical experience is sort of like the ultimate positive effect. What effect will that have on the immune system? Have we sort of discovered like a very hyper positive effect that may have a positive effect on the immune system? Will there be like a ceiling on it, or is it more or less open?
Yeah, I'm not super familiar with that, but it's definitely interesting questions.
Great. Well, thanks everyone for all the questions, and great job, Sophia. I'm really happy to see kind of a shift away from a sickness care system to a healthcare system. And I think it's really promising that you already have that mindset of cultivating health rather than trying to fix something once it's already like damaged. So going on, this is the last talk in the undergraduate section. It's Andrew Zuckerman, who is on the call, but he's not feeling super well. So we'll play his recorded talk and yeah, just ask questions in the chat, but we can likely skip the Q&A for that.
rolling? Cool. Well, my name is Andrew Zuckerman, and I'm a researcher at Quality Research Institute, which is a nonprofit independent group studying consciousness. And today I'm going to be talking about a software tool we made called the Tracer Replication tool. And I'm also going to talk about how it's used to collect qualia souvenirs. So this is a little snippet of the tool. This is something that I made along with Lawrence and Andres, who are both working at QRI alongside me. And before we go into the tool, I'm going to zoom out and start with my own keychain collection. So when I was younger, I collected keychains, and I didn't even put all of them here because I was embarrassed of, I think I have a little bit more than this, but you could get the idea. And, you know, what's the point of a keychain? Well, for me, I collected keychains when I was younger because I had so many keys. I'm just joking. I didn't have that many keys. The point of the keychain for me was like souvenirs for most other people. So some people collect mugs or postcards, or for me, a keychain. And what's the purpose of a keychain or a souvenir in general? You know, it's to store information or a memory about some interesting event. So maybe you went to Boise, Idaho, and it was some memorable experience. So you get a postcard to remember that event and that vacation. And there are many ways to store information from an experience. You could store text, maybe you could journal or write a note. And so maybe you wrote, I saw a young girl looking at her shadow on a wall, lit behind by multicolored lights. That's one way to store information. You could also store information with a photograph, which is what I show in the middle. And it gives you even more information because it does everything that text just did and even more. There's like so much visual information there. And even better is a video, right? A video has moving information. You could see the way the girl looks at the camera. If this video had sound, it'd be even more audio information, so it's more immersive. But you know, it doesn't capture everything, because a video like doesn't capture the smells you smell or like the tactile sensation of what it feels like to be you in that moment. And it also doesn't capture emotion, right? So I could be really happy when I took this video, or I could have been sad and nostalgic or something else. And you would never get any of that information by looking at this video. So videos are great, but they're not all the information. And especially they're not all the information on psychedelics or altered states. And maybe you know this, right? You're on some altered state and you try to take out a camera or a video of something you see, but then you remember the camera is not tripping on a drug. So even though your experience is altered and really interesting, the camera just records the same exact thing you record when you're sober. So it's really hard to like get the information of what it's like to be in an altered state, you know, and maybe the actual experience looked more like this, or maybe it's even more colorful or strange or weird, and these emotions we just can't capture with the video. So, I mean, I'm not the only one that has thought about this dilemma. There are like some memes sometimes, this is on Reddit, where someone says, guys, I finally understand, and it's just a photo of a wall. And right, like in the actual moment, you know, maybe this experience was super profound or beautiful, but this person was not able to capture the information back, and all they could get was just this wall, which is, you know, a phone could have taken that when you're sober. So here we are, and our goal is really, we're trying to collect qualia souvenirs. We're trying to bring back information from conscious states, and now, like, especially from exotic and altered states of consciousness. We have good technology, right? Photo, video, sound for recording what is like to be sober mostly, but when you're in an altered state, that's really challenging. So why should we collect qualia souvenirs? Well, one analogy from a different scientific field, biology, is that, you know, there were so many natural historians and biologists collecting and categorizing plants and animals and mushrooms. And over hundreds of years, they built up this taxonomy. And eventually, you know, this led to ideas such as evolution, which then led to ideas of genetics. And, you know, sorting nature and understanding the laws of nature lead to new ideas about it all works, how it all works. And then you might end up with other like awesome outputs. So once you understand genetics, then you could do, you know, like help people fix diseases and like cure illnesses. So in the same way that like collecting that data is so useful, probably collecting data from altered states and phenomenology is so useful if we're gonna eventually understand really important principles that explain the mind and explain consciousness. So, today, how do we take information back? We do have text in the form of trip reports. We also have replications where people try to recreate some photo or video representation of what their trip was like. And then, there's psychedelic artwork, which all these things are such, awesome already, but we could go even further. And so now I'm gonna walk you to the tool we made at QRI, and it's the tracer replication tool. So this is what it looks like. It sits right now on the internet. And the format is that there is two balls, one is bouncing and is no effects on it. So on the right side, you just see a bouncing ball. And on the left side, you have the ability to recreate what you're seeing in your visual field from tracers in your psychedelic experience. And there are all these parameters that you can use to affect what the tracer looks like. And the goal is to eventually recreate what you're seeing and then submit that as a data point for psychedelic research. So take back some quality souvenir from your experience. And just to recap, what is a tracer? Well, if you move your hand in front of your face, even when you're sober, there's a little bit of a blurriness where your hand is leaving. On psychedelic drugs in particular, that trail is even more accentuated. And there is a good representation on the left here of someone throwing an object, and you can see this huge trail following it. This is essentially what a tracer is. So for us, why tracers in particular? I think Andres said it really well in this write-up of our tool, and he wrote, "The artifacts of perception in alien states of consciousness are not noise. They provide hints for how normal experience is constructed." And in particular, psychedelic tracers, they could be a window into how rhythmic feedback dynamics are used to control the content of our experience. So another way to just think about this is that, if our perception of this world at any moment is almost like a movie, in normal sober experience, the frames are moving so fast and are so short that it's really hard to understand, how's this movie being made? What's the mechanics that's generating the movie? But when you are on these psychedelics and you have these tracers, they can reveal clues about, okay, how long is a frame and what are the properties of this movie construction system? So in these alien states, we get extra details about how this visual perception system is working. So the rest of the presentation, I'm going to pull a lot of information from this write-up that Andres wrote, and this is online on the internet too, that we can link to. So before we started this project, the only previous study we know that looked into the tracer effect and trying to quantify it was called Visual Trails, and it was about 10 years ago. So the way the authors went about this study is they took a movie and turned a movie into the stroboscopic poster that you're seeing here in the middle of the screen, and they did it with different frequencies. So maybe, this has, I don't know, 15, 20 after images that are all stitched together. You might have a same size poster, but above might only have 5 or 6, snapshots. And so these represent different frequencies that you're pausing the video at and taking a still. And so what they found just from people's memories when they looked at these photos and said, okay, what was it like when you took LSD? Which photo represents that most? A lot of people from their memory said 15 to 20 hertz. So that is already an awesome first step in quantifying these tracers. But this study has limitations, and that's because, first of all, tracers are drug dependent and dose dependent, right? So maybe on LSD, the tracers change as you increase the dose. And this is super dependent on which drug you take. And the other thing is there are different tracer effects. So in all of these recreations, we can isolate a few different effects. So in this one, in the first one, there's a trail. And this trail effect is just the general blurry motion that follows the object. There are also in the middle what we call a stroboscopic effect, where as these hands move in and out, they leave a copy of the hand where it once was in the frame. And the hand that is left over doesn't move, so it's just still. And then the last effect we call replay, where as you move a hand, it leaves copies of the hand, but they move and follow with the original motion. So that's a replay effect. So we made this tool to allow you to, create any of these effects to any degree and adjust tons of parameters. One of the first ones is the trail effect. So you could control how long or how large the trail follows your moving ball, and also how intense it is. So if it's really dark or really light. There's some other effects too, but for now, this is an important intro. Then we have a strobe effect, which is, like I said, leaves a copy of the ball behind. In this case, they just stay still. And then you also have the replay effect, which is like the strobe, but this time they move. And you could change the frequency. Again, you could change the intensity of this and how long they persist. After that, we included a couple other modifiers. So this is called an Adsr Envelope, and this comes from audio engineering. It stands for attack, decay, sustain, release. And it's how, some sound or amplitude moves over time. And in this case, when it leaves this second ball or third ball, that ball has like its own way of like fading out, which it could like happen very sharply and then trail off. And so you could add on these Adsr envelopes if you want to get even more fancy and share even more detail about what the tracers are like. We also have a color pulse. So for now, it's just the inverted color on the color spectrum, and people on certain drugs report this color switching. So we allow them to add this also as an effect, and they could change the frequency as well. And now it's like important to get into, okay, like what have we seen so far? So we haven't run any big studies so far. We created this tool and shared it with people in our network, and some people submitted data about what tracers are like. And the first thing, we found like a couple different categories with the limited data we have. The first is that there is this common light trailing effect with THC, so cannabis, and also HPPD, which is a perceptual disorder that some people get actually from taking psychedelics. Other people have it without taking psychedelics. But when people were looking at the ball in these states, there's this small trail effect. A second outcome is that psychedelics tend to have these strong replay and strobe effects. So this is 2CB in 2 different doses and 2 different methods of being ingested. And you can actually see what's interesting, the frequency of both of these data points are actually quite similar, which is starting evidence that, maybe like 2CB has a specific frequency. And then with another drug, DMT, you can see, oh, wow, like, first of all, this is crazy because is this really what it looks like if you're on DMT and looking at this little ball bouncing on the screen? And I guess the answer is yes, this is what it looks like. But yeah, there's also heavy stroboscopic and replay effects. And then one last like category that we found is that drugs like 5-MeO-DMT and MDMA have this smooth quality to it that you could create with the Adsr envelope, or you could create like with a mixture of the trail and the strobe, and you could tell that they're like a little softer and smoother. So, how could we use this data we're collecting? First of all, so far we're just collecting data from phenomenology, but ideally you can take this data from phenomenology and match it with neuroimaging data of someone in the same state. So you collect both at the same time. And this opens up some like pretty interesting questions that'd be great to answer. One is, if you see a 15 hertz stroboscopic effect or replay effect, is there some 15 hertz brainwave that we can identify in the visual cortex? And if there is, like, oh, that's like a pretty good start of an explanation. And if there isn't any 15 hertz oscillation anywhere, that also is like raises some interesting questions like, so how is this effect being generated? And so like, if we can continue this research further, it's important to collect brain data too, to start making interesting conclusions about what the brain is actually doing. The other thing is that so far our pilot data is pretty consistent with anecdotal evidence. So these are 2 replays or replications that people have made online that I found. And you could tell like, DMT in this replication, just like in our tracer tool, seems to be really high frequency. Like in time, it's changing pretty fast between colors and flashing. So from what we've collected and what people have historically wrote, the data already lines up. Okay, so what could we do besides learning about the brain? What could we do with this kind of tool? There's a really interesting couple things that I want to share. The first is a high meter, to standardize how intense a drug is affecting someone. So right, you have a certain thing, which is the dosage, but maybe a dose of 100 micrograms for someone affects someone really differently than someone else. It could be because of their body and their size, or it could be something with their brain. But this way, if you create this tool and you find out that, okay, like the average person on 100 micrograms, this is what they see on LSD, 200 micrograms, this is what they see, and so on. Then, if someone comes to you and fills out this tool, regardless of their dosage, you can say, oh, like what you took, that's, typical of a 100 microgram LSD trip. So it's a way to standardize actually how intensely psychedelics are affecting someone. And with enough data, maybe you could even reverse engineer what drug someone took. So you're at a music festival and someone comes in, they don't even know what drug they took. They could use this tool, try to fill out what their tracers look like. And depending on that, you could use some statistics to figure out, oh, it's like most likely that you took this drug at this dosage. So this seems like really cool possible application. Another awesome one is the idea of understanding drug synergy. So imagine we had 2 different drugs, drug A and drug B, And you could see they have different like replay frequencies. This one's even stroboscopic, this one's replay. And the question is, right, if someone take both of these drugs at the same time, what happens? So there's a couple of possibilities. One is that the drugs are orthogonal, their effects, in the sense that one and taking the second one, they don't interact at all. So you just have a stacking, an overlay of one effect on top of the other. You might also have suppression, where it seems like drug B could heavily suppress drug A. And you see that because the tracer that someone recreates on A plus B mostly looks like drug B. You might also have synergy, where the combination of the two drugs is actually even stronger than just the sum of the effects combined. And you might also have something like harmonization, where you have two different drug frequencies, but they end up like tuning each other towards some middle frequency in between. And this is, to me, is like also super fascinating because, you know, if you want to understand drug interactions previously, maybe you'll have to look at neurotransmitter levels or something more invasive to see, okay, how are these two drugs interacting and in what ways? But now, like, if you just help people become better phenomenologists, we might have the evidence just online in a non-invasive way about how drugs are interacting. And to me, that is awesome as well. And then one last effect is understanding the relationship between harmony and valence. Valence is how good or bad an experience feels. So we, besides collecting these tracers, if we start collecting data about, okay, when you're seeing this tracer that you just recreated, do you feel good and do you feel bad, and like at what intensity? And if we start to see that, okay, like when people feel really good, they also have these super consonant and smooth tracer effects. And when they feel really bad, they have these more dissonant effects. That might be evidence in favor of something at Curie that we have called the symmetry theory of valence, which is an explanation of why things feel good or bad. And I don't have time to go into that, but I'll let you explore it on your own. We have a YouTube video and some writings as well. So next steps for this project. So right now we're working to get IRB approval so we can actually collect large amount of data using this tool. And besides that, we also want to add some other perceptual tasks that we think will be especially like large effects with people who use psychedelics versus people who don't use psychedelics. So right now we're in that process, and hopefully, you know, in the next year, we'll have even more data to share about what we're finding. And, you know, I'd like to end by kind of just talking about phenomenology and how important it is once again, because really there's so much rich information in a psychedelic experience that it would, you know, we try sometimes to categorize our experiences at the end of a whole trip, and we use some type of survey, and these are really good at like as a baseline for getting information about what an experience is like. But if you think about it, a psychedelic experience might be different, so different, like every 10 minutes. And there's so much rich information about what it's like to be you when you're taking a psychedelic that if we can figure out better ways to collect that information and also pair it with brain data, we're going to have a much better understanding of how these things work and also how consciousness is created. It's like a way to reverse engineer our experiences. And specifically for psychedelic researchers, they should not be ignorant of maybe past psychedelic experiences they've had when they approach their research. They should use their experiences to inform research questions and say, oh, wow, that's like some really interesting effect I had, you know, 2 summers ago. Let me come up with a study or like an approach to isolate this specific effect. And it's really important that we like study these states in depth, because they are like these altered states, these boundary conditions of what consciousness and neuroscience can create. And it's almost like if we're physicists, it would be like, if we don't take these seriously, it would be like not taking black holes and plasma and superfluid helium seriously, and trying instead just to understand the brain or understand our universe sitting in room temperature in your living room, and like trying to understand it that way, or sitting, you know, just with your sober brain and trying to understand how neuroscience and consciousness works. So with that, I will end my presentation, and I'll thank you for listening, and I'll open the floor if any of you have questions.
Great job, Andrew. Actually, I do want to open it up for questions, and maybe he can answer them later for you guys. But I think this was a fascinating talk, so I'm really curious as to what you guys think. Questions or comments?
So that was really good, and I think you did a really good job of explaining. Like, I think I really like the analogy between classification of different types of plants and that leading to theories of evolution and whatnot. And I think over here too, you know, whether it's this particular visual paradigm or something else, that with all these effects together, we can potentially get to kind of larger theories that involve, you know, that of how psychedelics work. Or maybe even find novel effects that we wouldn't have known otherwise by kind of classifying all the like minute cognitive effects. But what was also cool about this is that this is a very particular kind of perceptual paradigm to psychedelics, because not very many other drugs or states sort of create these create trails, for example. So, but one of the things I guess I was wondering was that you do seem to extrapolate a lot. Like there could be from the data that I haven't, well, I didn't see enough data, right? Like it sounded like there's two 2CB reports, and I know that we spoke a little bit about this via email, but you know, since then it's like, yeah, if without having like thousands of subjects to be able to, because there's probably a lot of noise, especially with online reports, without having thousands of subjects, I hesitate, and I wonder if you'll actually will find something in all that noise. Like with the Arrowwood reports, it seems like there's things out there that are consistent across certain drugs. I just saw a preprint recently actually from one of my colleagues that they found, like, for example, that bipolar disorder or taking lithium plus psychedelics has a really high incidence of seizures. And so that was kind of like a cool thing that they found from the Arrowwood reports and whatnot. I just do wonder here if that is the case, and maybe if you can speak to this, if, for example, is it really the case that if somebody takes, the same individual takes 2CB twice, do they actually see the exact same trails? And for that matter, is it even across individuals? Like I've never heard people give me the same description of the visuals they get between LSD and psilocybin. Like I can't tell the difference between two people's trip reports, which one is which, and I doubt that even a language classifier could. So yeah, do you have more data to really speak to the consistency of these types of effects?
Yeah, so right now we're still at minimal data. We have about 25 samples, but we're starting to make progress because we're working with some researchers who do psychophysics and perception work in Belgium. So we might work with them to get the study off the ground. I'm pretty hopeful that if we reduce the number of parameters that the tool has, then there will be some really nice clustering between drugs. And there is always the worry, right? If you give so many parameters that you have so much data with each data point, you might be able to like overfit and find some pattern. But a lot of people do, even with their language, say, oh, this drug is super high frequency, or this drug is so and so. So I'm hopeful, and it is just a question we'll find an answer to hopefully in the next 12 months.
I guess with, to follow that up, well, one thing about the high frequency thing, it could just be a dosing. Like with DMT, for example, most people inhale it. They're not doing, oral DMT with the monoamine oxidase inhibitor. And that could just be you're taking a massive dose in 1 minute, and that could just result in faster, more whatever visuals compared to 2CB, which has to, slowly kind of build up. The other thing is how you measure these things. So for example, when people are on the drug, that's one thing of looking. We talked a little about this in email, I know. You're talking about visuals that might interact with the visuals that they're currently getting, and that could taint the experiment. The other problem is that just getting it post hoc, they probably don't remember very well in the first place what their visuals look like, because there's memory impairments from psychedelics. So it's kind of also, there's a measurement issue here that would be, I don't know how to resolve that, but there's, certainly you probably have to do both ways, honestly, and see that in both situations that there's converging evidence. But yeah.
Well, on the we actually might change the design of the tool a little bit, but there is a possibility. So in some psychophysics studies, the goal is actually to eliminate some perceptual effect that you have. And one way we could imagine doing this is if, you have a blue ball bouncing and someone sees a blue tracer, we could have them control the color in such a way that, okay, find the negative of this, some version of yellow, they'll cancel out the blue you're seeing. And then from there, you could, change all the other parameters of frequency and replay. And instead, it's not like try to recreate it and have like double vision, but try to cancel out the tracers you see. And once you get it, like it's barely there, submit that data point. And, we could still pull all the frequency data, and the color could just be an interesting point, but less important.
That's amazing, man. That would be really cool if you could do that. If you could kill people's psychedelic effects.
Hey, that was an amazing presentation. Thank you so much. As you were talking, I was thinking about You mentioned kind of like comparing some things between HPPD and then just like current use of LSD. And I found myself thinking about Alice in Wonderland syndrome, and I was wondering if you had included any people with that syndrome and used them as kind of a comparison point for any of the things that you're studying.
Yeah, we didn't have anyone with that syndrome fill out the tool. I'm curious, I know it's a little bit about size perception, but what effect do you think it might have if someone used this tool?
I mean, I don't know. I just think it would be interesting because people with that syndrome report a lot of the same perceptual experiences, but it's completely kind of just, it just happens spontaneously rather than taking anything. So I'd just be curious. I mean, it might be an interesting comparison point, but yeah, I have no idea about specifics.
Well, if you do know anyone with Alice in Wonderland syndrome,
I do actually.
Yeah, you could put us in touch and we could figure out a way to collect data.
Yeah, for sure.
Thank you.
You might be interested in knowing that in years past, when people were tripping, a common thing to do was to look your friend in the eye and move your hand and sing "Happy Trails to You."
Yeah, I just as a tech entrepreneur myself, I am fascinated by what you're doing. I think it's really interesting and challenging, I can imagine, and especially depending on how, if the person is trying to manipulate the variables themselves, if they're high, I can imagine actually doing that properly. But I guess I'm curious, are you also looking at, like, it looks like you kind of crowdsource some of the data points. Are you planning to do more of that, like through Psychonaut Wiki or Arrowhead or places like that, to kind of get lots of those data points? And then if so, how are you going to try to control for just bad data?
Yeah, I think that'll definitely be the approach. So we don't have a license at QRI right now to give anyone psychedelics. So we would be doing an observational study where people can use a computer if they're voluntarily tripping on their own. And there's a study at Imperial that's doing something similar with cognitive tasks. So this is an approach. And for channel of reaching people, Psychonaut Wiki, Subjective Effect Index, maybe Arrowhead will talk to these websites and see if they'll put the link to the study up on their homepage. And yeah, for bad data, this is again an interesting question, right? And I think it comes down to, for us, redesigning this tool so it's really easy to use. And there's even a walkthrough for how to use it, because doing studies from your home or like on your own time, there's probably less pressure to do things right than if you're sitting in the psych department lab room. So we're thinking about that, and we're not sure how we'll handle bad data or what that even looks like yet, but we're going to do a lot of preventative work to make it super easy for a participant.
In addition to the external qualia, when most people talk qualia, that's what they mean. There's the internal sense, like this is real, this is really real, this is realer than real, or sense of sacredness or truth. Do you know anybody who's trying to do phenomenological studies of what I might call internal qualia?
Yeah, well, I mean, for us, I think it's all internal qualia, but like the way we think about it and use that word. But that's actually a great thing. And I think the dimension you're talking about, how real does my experience feel? Because I think on some experiences, an experience could feel, oh, this is even more real than a normal day. What does that mean? Like more real? And you could have dreams that feel even more real than like other dreams. So we've actually just talked about this dimension internally, like the realness factor of an experience. And I think it is pointing at a real thing, like a real aspect of experience. And it might be related to resolution. So if you have a more high definition experience with more information per moment of time, that might correspond to this feeling of realness, though we're not sure, we haven't collected data on this. But yeah, I mean, that's what our research group is all about, is like trying to really quantify and figure out how all these different aspects of a single conscious experience relate, and what are the scales and the boundaries, like how high up on the realness factor can you go, and how far down can you go? And for that dimension, maybe it is a natural kind. Like there is actually this thing called realness that we're getting at. And maybe we'll find out, oh no, it doesn't really make sense. But we're really interested in those questions. So I'm glad you asked.
Well, psychedelics allow people to do experimental studies in things like realness and sacredness and truth and knowledge. And we can look at those things now experimentally instead of just sitting back and as a philosopher and thinking about them.
Okay, guys. So yes, thank you, Andrew. That was an excellent presentation, and I really enjoyed the Q&A session. So that concludes our undergrad portion. We'll start getting into the three graduate students now, and we're starting off with Alex Siloff.
Great, thank you. All right, ready to go whenever?
Go ahead.
Alrighty. Hello and welcome. My name is Alex, and I'm a PhD student in social psychology. In this talk, I'm going to take you through my journey of learning about death anxiety and the connection I see between death anxiety and psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. Specifically, I'd like to pose the argument that death anxiety plays a more central role in the therapeutic process of psychedelics. So to start, I'd like to tell you a little bit about myself. So first things first, I know for a fact, unequivocally, that I'm going to die someday. I also really love the scientific method. In about 2015, I watched the show Cosmos, hosted by Carl Sagan and Neil deGrasse Tyson. And this made me fall in love with the scientific method. It made me realize that I wanted to earn my PhD and be part of the scientific method. And so then I had to wonder, what field do I want to get my PhD in? What kind of questions do I want to ask? And at that time in my life, the question keeping me up at night was, why do people believe weird stuff? Right, and I think this is everybody. I think there's something that every one of us believes that someone else thinks is weird. Me, for example, I don't think time is as linear as it feels like on a day-to-day basis. I also never liked Game of Thrones, just never called to me, couldn't do it. Watched a couple episodes, and I promise you there's someone watching this who thinks I'm weird for believing those things. Although maybe they'd use words other than weird, but it's kind of in this way that I think there's something that everybody believes that someone else thinks is weird. Then I wondered, what field do I go into to answer questions like this? And psychology seemed to be the answer. Specifically, existential psychology is where I ended up, which is this realm that I call like kind of the place that you end up at if you continue to ask the question why. And in this way, we're kind of like toddlers, right? You just keep asking why, from whatever your starting point is. So for example, if I'm talking to my buddy, I'm like, hey man, what you doing today? Oh, you know, just working. Why? So I can earn money. Why? So I can buy things like food. Why? Because if I don't eat food, I'm going to die. And before you ask, I don't know why we die. It's just stop asking that question, all right? So the existential. This is the realm that we conduct research on. We answer questions of being and becoming. So as an existential psychologist, I conduct my research through a specific lens that is called terror management theory. I'm calling it a lens because a psychological theory is, I consider it like a tool that you can pick up and look through it. You can look through that theory in order to understand and examine human attitudes and behavior. And so to understand the starting point for terror management theory, I want you to do a thought experiment with me. I want you to imagine you're one of our ancient ancestors, way back in time, like way ancient. And you are the first living being to come into the awareness that you are going to die someday. And now this is a different thing than just a general awareness of death. This is different than being aware that one of your tribe members may die someday. This is different than recognizing that a predator could kill you. This is the awareness that no matter what you do, even if you escape all predators that ever attack you, even if you always have food, always have water, shelter, that no matter what you do, you're going to die someday. But at the same time that you've developed this awareness, you also have this evolutionary drive to survive, this drive that's telling you that you need to get food, you need to sleep, you need to mate, all these things. And so these two kind of things come into conflict with one another, because what's the point in getting all the food and the sleep and mates and whatever if and trying to avoid death on a day-to-day basis if I'm still going to die at the end of the day anyways. So these come into conflict, and it arises this existential anxiety. And terror management theory says that we need to manage that anxiety, otherwise we would be debilitated by it, because what's the point? So the way that terror management theory says that we manage this death anxiety is by denying it, right? But we do it in this kind of clever way by developing these alternate storylines, where in these alternate storylines, the end is not death. Basically, they offer us some feeling of immortality, and we call these cultural worldviews, whereas Ernest Becker might call it an immortality project. And so we have these belief systems, but you can't just believe, you have to play along. You have to live up to the standards of your own worldview. And once you do this, you earn self-esteem. So the combination of believing in and living up to your cultural worldviews offers you this sort of anxiety buffer, this buffer that keeps death anxiety and death thoughts at bay, allowing you to live your life with some sense of equanimity. So in summary, terror management theory says that this uniquely human awareness of death leads to this existential anxiety, and that anxiety needs to be managed. And we manage it by believing in and living up to our cultural worldviews. So then this begs the question, what happens if our beliefs and our ability to live up to those beliefs are not adequately managing death anxiety? And that those death thoughts are allowed to come close to consciousness, what happens then? Now I'm going to ask you to put that question in your back pocket for now, and we're going to come back to that just a little bit later. So you recall that the question that drove me into psychology in the first place was, why do people believe weird stuff? And I found that terror management theory provides an answer to this, which is basically, in an attempt to keep death anxiety at bay, we each develop different, but of course overlapping beliefs or worldviews. And so this more or less satisfied the answer to my initial question. But now another question keeps me up at night. But in order to understand that question, I want to tell you a little bit more about myself first. While I was over here in undergrad studying terror management theory in Colorado, I was also over here enjoying some newfound freedoms, some freedoms that I gained from separating from the military and becoming a civilian. So as a civilian, I immediately took advantage of two new freedoms that I had. First was to grow a beard. Second was to try marijuana, which I did for the first time at the age of 27. Immediately after doing this, I recognized that the DARE program was not entirely truthful about what marijuana was all about. And it made me wonder, what else was the DARE program not entirely truthful about? And this question led me to psychedelics. And this interest started out slow at first. I just read a couple articles, thought it was interesting. But the deeper I went, the more interesting things got. And that led to reading a lot of books, podcasts, lots of Tim Ferriss, and the like. And two things stood out to me immediately. First was that psychedelics were being used to successfully treat a wide variety of mental health diagnoses. And the second was that after taking psychedelics, a lot of people reported being less afraid of death. Then these effects seemed to be enduring. They lasted for a while after people's experiences. In the clinical trials of psychedelics, they last at least 6 months, and some evidence suggests that they might last longer than that. So then I got to wondering, what does terror management theory say about mental illness? And the short answer to this question is that it's another method of managing terror, of managing this existential anxiety. Specifically, it's a maladaptive method in that it doesn't allow you to adapt to your environment very well. So you recall that question I had you put in your back pocket. What happens when when your worldview and your ability to live up to your worldview are not adequately managing the death anxiety? And one possibility is that they develop into these mental health symptoms. So this made me wonder, what if psychedelics are transforming maladaptive terror management methods into more adaptive methods? But then how does this work? What's the connecting thread between terror management theory and psychedelics? And this question led me to the work of psychiatrist and professor Robert J. Lifton, whose work influences influenced the early development of terror management theory back in the 80s and 90s. And Robert Lifton outlined these 5 modes of death transcendence. The first one is the biosocial, which kind of has these 2 components. This is the bio part, which is through having kids and sort of living on by passing on your genes to your kids. And then there's the social component, which is through identity. So identifying with some sort of social group that's larger than yourself and that will endure beyond your own life. For example, national identity. By identifying with the nation that you belong to and being part of that, you sort of gain this sense of immortality. The second mode is the theological. So this is the religious solution to the problem of death, which often provides some answer to what happens after death, form of an afterlife. Then there's the creative mode. So this is through creating something and putting it out into the world, something that can live on beyond you. This can, of course, look like creating art and paintings and whatnot, sculptures, but it can also look like creating a new business, or if it's important to you, a kitchen remodel. And there's the natural modes. This is another identity piece by identifying yourself as part of nature and knowing that when you die, your body will return to nature and you kind of live on by being part of nature still. So then these first 4 modes of death transcendence generally fall under this larger umbrella category of worldview beliefs that's kind of in line with terror management theory. But then the 5th mode that Robert Lifton outlined is a little different than the others. He calls it this experiential mode of transcendence, which is just this fleeting experience. And a fleeting experience can't be part of your worldview belief, so it's a little different. And Robert Lifton described it as this, and I quote, "Experiential transcendence is of a different order from the others. It depends entirely on a psychic state, one so intense and all-encompassing that time and death disappear. Characteristic of the ecstatic state is a sense of extraordinary psychic unity, perceptual intensity, and of ineffable illumination and insight." Some of you may know where this is heading because this sounds an awful lot like a mystical experience that about 2/3 of people who take the high dose session with a psychedelic in the clinical trials report having this experience. And of the people who have this experience, they rate it amongst the top 5 most meaningful experiences of their lives, up there with things like birth of children, marriage, death of parents, and the like. And so this experiential transcendence that Robert Lifton talked about, and the mystical experience, which happens from psychedelics, for all intents and purposes, seem to be the same thing. I'm just going to refer to them as mystical experiences from here on out. But then what is it about this mystical experience that's so big? What's the big deal here? What I think it is that they illuminate what's important and worthy of a person's time and attention, generally relating to one or more of the first 4 modes of transcendence. And that when people have these experiences, they see these things in their psychedelic therapy. If they integrate those things into their worldview belief, it could come away with this adaptive worldview transformation that should theoretically be more effective at managing death anxiety. And so these worldview transformations, what I think they look like is basically a revised or more intrinsic worldview belief. And I'll define intrinsic in just a moment here, but this plus a greater motivation to live up to those beliefs. Remember, because you can't just believe, you have to play along. You have to live up to the standards. That's what I mean by intrinsic. An intrinsic worldview belief is that it's an end in itself. This is in comparison to extrinsic, which is a means to an end. So for example, if I hold a job for an extrinsic reason, maybe I'm holding that job in order to get money. And so then the job is a means to the end of money. Whereas if I'm holding a job for an intrinsic reason, I'm holding that job simply because of the value I get from doing that job. And so yeah, these revised or more intrinsic worldview beliefs, sort of this intrinsic shift in a person's worldview. And some examples of the way that I could see this working out, generally speaking, is that if someone has some sort of spiritual encounter during their mystical experience, and if they integrate that into their worldview, they could come away from that experience with a more intrinsic belief in God. Or for the natural mode, maybe people have this unitive experience during a mystical experience, which is the idea that they have the sense that everything is one. All things, all beings, we're all one. If a person integrates that experience into their worldview, they could come away with this new belief in unity with nature. Or for the biosocial mode, maybe someone gains, during their mystical experience, they have some sort of new perspective on a relationship in their life. And if they integrate that perspective into their worldview, they could come away with a more intrinsic sense of love and commitment towards their friends and family. So then the way I see this working out in psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, if you remember from the terror management theory lens, these mental health symptoms are basically a maladaptive way of managing death anxiety. So they come into therapy, they take the psychedelics, and they have this mystical experience. This experience illuminates what's important to them. And then to the extent that they're able to integrate those experiences, whatever it is that they see that's important to them, into their worldview, they should come away with this more intrinsic and more aligned beliefs and actions that should lead to a more properly functioning anxiety buffer, something that's more properly managing death anxiety. And when you do this, the idea here is that when you treat the cause, the symptoms should fall away of their own weight. Yeah, so you remember that I started with this argument that death anxiety plays a more central role in the therapeutic process of psychedelics. And specifically what I'm considering this in more technical terms is a transdiagnostic construct. Big word here, but trans being beyond, diagnostic being a single diagnosis. So death anxiety is something that goes beyond a single diagnosis. It's something that could underlie, for example, anxiety, depression, OCD, all these things. It could be underlying all of them. And that's what's really being treated in psychedelic therapy, or at least one of the big things. Of course, there's going to be nuances between different diagnoses, but generally speaking, it's this transdiagnostic construct. And I made this argument by talking about a little bit of death anxiety, death awareness, cultural worldviews, terror management theory, and these weird things called mystical experiences. So some potential implications I see for this and future directions I'd like to go. For one thing, I think terror management theory could offer a lot of input to psychedelic interventions. Now, I'm not clinically oriented at this point in my research, but I do see potential for this down the road. And then more broadly speaking, I think social and existential psychology offer a lot of rich theoretical framework. Specifically, it's empirically tested, or there's been a lot of experiments conducted that have informed and built the theories in social and existential psychology. And I think they offer a lot of rich directions for research to go with the psychedelic sciences. And also, if I could just hark back to the 70s for a moment and the peace, love, and hippie movement, there is some research that supports the idea that intrinsically oriented worldviews or self-esteem gained from intrinsic worldviews is more stable than extrinsic self-esteem. And it's also found that people with this kind of self-esteem are less defensive in one another. So it could sort of offer this explanation for why psychedelics were such a central part of the whole peace, love, hippie movement. And also, I do see some overlap between this idea of an intrinsically oriented worldview and some other researchers in the field, specifically the idea of like connection to self, which is something that Rosalind Watts and Carhart Harris and their team up at Imperial College London talk about. So I do see some potential for overlapping theoretical ideas there. And also, this sort of has some implications for a certain red versus blue dynamic that we're seeing in the world today coming to a head. And this is the idea that terror management theory at least offers a perspective on this, showing us what we're up against in this dynamic, showing us that our worldview beliefs exist to protect us from our fear of death, essentially. So when you have worldviews clashing, what it feels like to the person having their worldview challenged is somewhat like a matter of life and death. And yeah, I think if psychedelics are making people more intrinsically oriented and less defensive, I just see a connection there for future research to explore. I would also really like to do some research with non-drug inductions for mystical experiences, because so I was saying that psychedelics induce mystical experiences, but they aren't the only thing that bring about these kind of transcendent experiences. So I would like to conduct some of my research on this. I also have a couple collaborations under the way. I do have some empirical data collected at this point. So yeah, I'd like to continue collecting more of that in the future. And of course, I couldn't have done any of this by myself. So I'd like to thank my mentor, Jeff Greenberg, along with the other two co-founders of terror management theory, Tom Pazinski and Sheldon Solomon, then all of the other terror management theory researchers out there, who've contributed to the 1,000+ empirical articles that now support the core ideas of terror management theory. And also, I'd like to thank everyone else who played a part in the development of this presentation. And if you're interested in any further reading, Ernest Becker wrote The Birth and Death of Meaning and the Denial of Death. And they're good books to understand the sort of theoretical concepts underlying terror management theory. And if you'd like to understand terror management theory itself a little bit more, The Worm at the Core is a good book to pick up. And of course, a few references, like I mentioned, all of these ideas that I was talking about today are supported by empirical research. And here are a few jumping off points you could check out if you were interested in that research. Thank you very much for coming up.
Questions?
Alex, have you tried fitting in your work to the work of Stan Grof, Transpersonal Psychology, and Maslow? I think that would add some richness to your field, particularly Grof.
I am familiar with Grof. I've read some of his work. A lot of it, yeah, at this point, since I'm an early PhD student, I don't see a whole lot of ability for me to integrate those ideas. I'm kind of like working on just slowly building off of what I can with terror management theory, but I do see relevance there. Also, Otto Rank is another, he was a big one who influenced like Ernest Becker. So yeah, Otto Rank, Stan Grof, for sure, I see some overlap there. And then Maslow. I'm not as familiar with Maslow's work, but I do kind of see it there, like the self-transcendence concepts he was talking about towards his later years.
Now, his self-transcendence is very much like the mystical experience that you and Lipton are describing.
Yeah, and there's been lots of theorists who've talked about these things over time. I mean, William James talked about it, Freud and his oceanic feeling and stuff. So there's a lot of people who've talked about these things, and I definitely see a lot of different directions that this research could go.
Any more comments or questions? Okay. Well, great job, Alex. I had never heard of this theory before, and I think it kind of maybe ties in a little bit with like what Sophia was saying about what is like a broader mechanism. So yeah, thank you. I definitely learned a lot. So before we get into Katie's talk, Katie's next, I just want to remind the judges, like if you want to fill out the form, it's really mostly to give feedback to the presenters, feedback and or questions, but you will have 5 to 10 minutes together to deliberate on who gets the top position in undergrad and grad. So don't worry too much about it. It's really for the students. And yeah, you'll get some time at the end. All right, so next up is Katie Stone. And Katie, you can unmute and share.
She says she's switching to a stronger Wi-Fi, so let's just give a sec.
Hey y'all, thanks Isla. I just stepped back in and I'm wondering, because we did have some audio issues last time when we did the recordings, if I should maybe try to also call in on my phone or if I should leave my camera disabled, what you think might be the best to ensure as much continuity as possible.
I would say we can try. I think it was working well with the camera disabled, right? Last time.
Yeah, it was. Okay, I'll go ahead and do that. And awesome, get myself set up here.
Thanks.
Sorry, it's taking a second. Okay, can you see that all right?
Yes.
Awesome. Okay. I'm gonna take one drink of water and then I'll be ready to go. Okay, friends, I think I am all set. So should I get started or do you want to have go and set me off like we did before?
Yeah, go ahead and get started.
Beautiful. Well, hello, everyone. I'm sorry that you can't see my face, but I will be back after. My name is Katie Stone, and welcome to my PsychedelX talk. So I'm going to try and cover a lot of ground today. First, I'm going to situate you into my particular fields of study. Then we'll walk through my psychedelic and childbirth-inspired transition from a non-spiritual type A pre-med to an aspiring psychedelic midwife. And finally, I'll conclude with where my research focus has landed, and we'll consider the value of exiting this psychedelic renaissance. But first, a few important frameworks. So rather than working with psychedelics from an anthropocentric psychology, I draw from ecopsychology. Ecopsychology emerged to help us find our way back to the awareness that we are the earth having a human experience, and that we are a part of, not a part from nature. One primary lesson from ecopsychology is reciprocity. This lesson is beautifully illuminated, I think, in the relationship between mother and child in the womb, and also in the web of life evident across all ecosystems. And like reproductive health, it speaks to sovereignty and autonomy, and a pregnant person's right to choose whether to give birth to life. Secondly, we'll look at transpersonal sociology. And remember that sociology arose as an attempt to understand social facts, and these facts are used to describe social structures that shape the reality we all experience. In transpersonal sociology, we emphasize how transpersonal encounters such as psychedelic use or childbirth will uniquely impact our daily face-to-face interactions. So in other words, the social facts that you use to integrate your transpersonal experiences help structure the society that we all live in. So for our discussion, we're going to focus on the micro-social structures around the transpersonal experience of childbirth and how that shapes society and ultimately our shared reality. The most important thing to remember here, and this could be controversial depending on your paradigm that you work within, but there is no universal psychedelic experience, just like there is no universal birth experience, even though both dive into these transpersonal realms. So what I want to remind people is that we may be having our own experiences and our own realities, but those are still mediated by the structures of the society that we live within. And as we move through the rest of this presentation, I would like you to think about what mental templates and models you use to integrate your experiences and why. So that's my starting point for my framework that I've been using to integrate my own traumas. And I did want to give a brief content warning. I will be talking about abortion and birth narratives. My stories won't be graphic, but if you feel like you want to pause and then come back, feel free, of course. And I know this might sound like a lot, so if you are not sticking around for the rest of this, I do want to leave you with a little bit of, well, the full reality of my presentation. So how did I depart my perfectly planned path toward becoming a trauma surgeon, and what caused the diversion? My story, of course, starts at birth. And when I tell my birth story, I'm usually complaining about it. I was a scheduled C-section 5 days before Christmas, and I wasn't ready to leave the womb. I'm still offended about it. And I often wonder how people start their own birth story off. Were you born, or did your mother give you birth? My mother doesn't tell my birth story. She died 5 years after it started, but she did leave me a journal that was filled with some details about our short time together. 27 years after she died, I received these journals from my father and flipped to the first page, excited to see what her experience of my birth story was. And the thing that she had to say was that it's taken a while for her, but she finally started feeling some affection for me and even found a way to like me. I was crushed by this realization. I felt like I was losing her all over again because my entire concept of unconditional maternal love as being some sort of inherent biological certainty just completely evaporated. Was she a bad mother? Was I a bad child? Did it have to be either one of those things? As I drifted to sleep that night, my subconscious dropped me off in one of my mindscapes, and I got to work processing things that I had no words to give voice to. And like any good subconscious, it threw me a very traumatic experience to help me piece it together. And so in my dream that night, I murdered my mother in a very high definition detail, as vivid as any psychedelic vision. And I woke up screaming and horrified for the first time, realizing that my life up until that point, I'd just been reliving my mother's. Every path, every decision, every job, every career choice had all been in an attempt to try and find her. And I was doing this to my own detriment. And I had to start wondering, is there another way to know her if I wasn't going to just echo her life? And that wasn't what I expected when I revisited my birth story. And that just left me wondering and looking for answers, and turning to my unique spiritual practices and my favorite scholars. I began unpacking the entire experience, not just for my own mother, but also of this grander idea of mother and the role this archetype played in society. And if it wasn't this unconditionally loving and serving and giving thing, what was it? How could my mother have rejected me? And as I got into the research around my birth, I found out that C-sections can really mess with attachment processes, and that our birth process really matters for the rest of our overall health. So while in the psychedelic renaissance, we attribute this insight around birth and trauma to the father of transpersonal psychology himself, Stan Grof didn't really discover this no more than Hoffman discovered ergot, which was used safely in midwifery for ages. So rather than merely describing things that were already known by others, there was this pattern of structures just being translated into a modern paradigm, even though they existed elsewhere. And as I started looking at the history of womb wisdom and birthrights in transpersonal realms and power of childbirth, I started getting into theology and these goddess cultures, things that my Christian upbringing had no stories about. And I realized that in order to truly understand my mother from this other spiritual process, I was going to have to start reframing everything I had learned about spirituality up to that point, and also about women for that matter. It became important to reconsider the idea of the term of women and mothers, being that there was so much gender roles tied into the term. I wanted to find a way to get beyond that, to develop my own idea of a cosmology that was helpful. I wanted to find the archetype built into this reciprocal relationship between child and womb and mother, and to work with that archetype in a way that supported my own growth and facilitated my own changes. And I started looking for examples of experiences that women had using these kinds of sacraments throughout history. And of course, came around the term entheogen. But the more I wrote with that, the more it started bringing up all of this baggage left over from my spiritual upbringing in Christianity. So wanting to find my own path, I decided I had permission to create my own terms, and decided to go to grad school to figure out, well, what to do with all this. And this my inquiry started. And as I started diving into the literature, finding no other helpful frameworks for the ways I was engaging with these substances, I decided to create my own term. So instead of saying I'm using an entheogen, I began using entheogen. And it started changing the way I related to the substances and to the spiritual practices that were coming up. And because I defined it in my own terms, it had more meaning to it. And I was able to give it the frameworks that helped me recover from my trauma. So this was the spiritual foundation I had. I was going to try and start integrating some of my really intense traumatic experiences. And this is our little trigger warning here, if you'd like to pause, if you're not comfortable hearing about abortion processes. Yeah, we'll begin with the womb being humanity's original alchemical vessel, which was different than what I was taught as a pre-med. Like most pre-meds, I was taught that the womb and childbirth and the menstrual cycle and the pain of it were all normal and natural things, but all of that was based upon this underlying level of me replicating and perpetuating the sins of Eve that I had inherited. I was having pain and trauma and suffering because I deserved it. So like many women, when I started to feel empowered in my own womanhood, I began using hormonal birth control, thinking that I was making good and healthy decisions for myself. But I found out eventually when I became a statistic that I was being lied to. So this occurred during my undergraduate. I was doing extended cycling with my birth control, which allowed me to only have 4 cycles annually because periods were annoying and I didn't want to deal with it. And by the time I missed my first cycle, I'd been having weird dreams about babies for weeks, and I had been suddenly and inexplicably depressed. 3 days after that missed cycle, I was in my bathroom with a positive pregnancy test, just completely numb to the new reality. The next day I was at the student clinic, still numb, but then I became very confused because the doctor's test came back negative. And 3 times I asked her to redo the test. 3 times she brushed me away, telling me her machines and scans were never wrong. And instead she looked at my mental health history and sent me home with Valium, Klonopin, and Zoloft. She did tell me on my way out the door to have a good summer, but 2 months later, I was standing at an overpass ready to jump. The memory of my dog is what called me home, and scared out of my mind, I called a friend for help. That weekend, we built a sacred space and settled into a visionary experience. I had hoped it would loosen the roots of my depression, but instead it ended up introducing me to the child that was struggling to manifest in my womb. We had a lot to talk about, and the next day I walked myself back to the student clinic, demanded a blood draw, and found out that I was in fact 26 weeks pregnant and things were not okay. A week later, I was flying to New Mexico to abort a maldeveloped child. The experience was nothing like the movies taught me. The procedure lasted for 5 days. The fetal heartbeat was terminated on day 1, and on day 5, my body naturally began to birth the terminated fetus. By law, no painkillers were allowed to be administered, nor can my family legally be present. I was about to learn firsthand that pain was the window to the transpersonal realms of birth. But before we go there, I'd like you to think about what you know about the history of pregnancy. For me and most of my peers, a pregnancy was a pathology of the uterus, a condition to be managed and intervened upon. I even once heard a fetus compared to a parasite. I was certainly never taught what my ancestors knew, that birth could be a transpersonal experience. And I had, of course, to start asking why. And what many know, but many do not, during Renaissance Europe, the traditional holders of womb wisdom were systematically imprisoned and tortured and forced out of the birthrights, which had not only offered women empowerment, but diverse spiritual cultures that had developed over thousands of years of social evolution. These cultures should have been my birthright, but they'd been systematically eliminated due to new male-only medical guilds that were popping up. And the womb bearers like me were transformed into birth machines for capitalists and tyrants. It's a condition we have never recovered from, and we've never restored our autonomy since this happened back in the Renaissance. So while this happened, womb wisdom did not completely disappear outright or permanently across the US, and also in Europe. But meanwhile, as this was happening during the 20th century, women were now instead being forced into very unsafe birth conditions. Women were being drugged, strapped to gurneys, going through these things called twilight births, where they never remembered they even gave birth at all. By the 21st century, they were scheduling C-sections around holidays out of fear and convenience. And I have to imagine what kind of attachment trauma at scale was passed down across generations, left unhealed for centuries in a culture that was already thriving off of shame and fear. Suddenly I began to see how massive this problem was. It wasn't just my childbirth experience and my mother's, but this legacy of trauma that was being imprinted during the birthright process. So while historically childbirth had been a space for transpersonal healing and spiritual growth since the dawn of humanity, modern birthrights in the US are seemingly designed to ritualize the historical narrative imposed by a patriarchal medical establishment. And you can take a pick from this list, and please go follow up on any of these. I encourage you to. We will only be focusing on the loss of access to natural reproductive health treatment. So I know it's easy to justify psychedelic midwifery as a practice for preparing future mothers to give birth. And it makes sense that psychedelic midwives could support birthing women in navigating transpersonal states during birth. But what about uncommon birth, like in the case of stillbirth or an abortion? Is normal birth the only allowable birthright? You tell me. So it was around 5 hours into my labor, and I was convinced I was going to die from the pain. And suddenly I was no longer in my body, but thrown into a red desert landscape where I encountered 2 entities: the familiar Earth Mother on the ground, and above her in the starlight, the silhouette of someone I had never encountered in any of my experiences. I didn't know what else to call her, so I went with the creatrix, and she had a lot to say. While my Earth Mother was holding me on the ground, helping me through the pain of the birth, every contraction, the creatrix was showing me all of the pain that the earth had felt with every bomb and bulldozer and burning forest. We were feeling it together. She showed me that my womb was the earth's womb, that we were both these alchemical vessels that supported earth's development, not just my own. And intermixed with all of these visions and scenes and insights were the scenes of my own assaults and my own abuses and the own violations I had had within my own body. So as the earth was healing herself in this transpersonal state, I was also healing myself. We were sharing in this load and this pain together. It's incredibly powerful, incredibly profound. The entire process, I realized through the insights that I was downloading from this creatrix that life may have begun in the stars, but the earth was a living womb of a planet. It was sacred, and the ritual of childbirth was where we womb bearers access these consciousness states that would allow us to update the genetic code, so to speak, for the next generation. So it wasn't just for my own lineage that I was able to heal things through childbirth, but also more broadly, thinking of the earth as an alchemical vessel, I was helping with the earth's healing process as well. Grew, the creatrix eventually faded and the earth mother held me, and eventually I reached a point where the lights were going out in the sky and I thought I couldn't take it anymore, and I screamed aloud, "I can't," and the nurse responded saying that I had, and then it was over and the entities were gone. And in the recovery room, I rested reading the journals left by the women who came before me, many of them who had found themselves similarly surprise pregnant, and all of us were scared, terrified, poor, young, old, raped. It was an entire spectrum of experience, but no one was careless about their decision. Everyone was empowered to exercise their birthright, but society was shunning them for it. And I started wondering, what if I didn't want to feel ashamed of the point where I was shut down? What if I didn't just want to numb it with drugs and with work? Was there a way I could develop a spiritual practice to understand and integrate this change and this trauma? The answer is, of course, yes. And that's when I'm psychedelic midwifery. So I hear that we want to train millions of therapists, and I get that. And I fully support it, but at the same time, I am personally really tired of playing whack-a-mole with mass mental health. When we know that there are systematic solutions for all of these things that keep coming up in therapy, I want to go to the source of them, to start in childbirth and just start with where these things are coming from in our psyches. And I believe that this new type of midwifery could start supporting that. So I think that the way I like to describe birth is as the other universal experience that's missing from psychedelic research. And while end-of-life anxiety is incredibly important, so is postpartum psychosis and the fear of dying in childbirth, where there are at minimum 2 lives held in balance. And if we thought about midwifery practices and we had women's health in mind and we looked at our integration models for psychedelics, I'm really convinced we'd see a lot different understandings, and we'd start talking more, not just about set and setting, but also support and the community circumstances by which these new selves and healings are being birthed into. I also think we'd be paying a lot more attention to the variations of hormones and dosage and experiences relevant to menstrual cycles and hormonal therapy, because men give birth too. So we put this in the context of the reality of the situation. The United States has the highest maternal mortality rate of all developed nations. And when I hear about all of these things that have happened, that it's no surprise to me why my peers and I are so scared of birth. And if we can face death anxiety with psychedelics, I really think we can start facing birth anxiety with them as well, and start helping women to learn to trust their bodies, to learn to think intuitively in preparation for conception and childbirth, and to put a sacred meaning back behind it. And I think if we do this, well, we'll be accomplishing a lot more than we would just by thinking of things in terms of an allopathic Western medical framework. And I get this lesson from The Story of the Farm, which is one of my favorite folklore stories within psychedelia history. Anna Mae Gaskin was the founder of spiritual midwifery, and she was part of a community that in 1969 learned in real time that babies don't wait for hospitals and that buses don't make great delivery rooms. And the process of birth kind of comes whether or not you're planning for it. And as they started to be forced by necessity to reintegrate these traditional birth processes, this group of hippies began to realize that the transpersonal realms of birth that they were experiencing were very much like the psychedelic spaces they knew very, very well. And being so familiar with these domains of transpersonal growth and pain, they were able to not just have a childbirth experience that was positive, but beneficial. They had orgasmic childbirths, which is just a complete difference between what my grandmothers were experiencing being drugged and shackled to a bed. Big difference. And I want to see more of that and continue to grow beyond that. So beyond the actual trauma of giving birth, the psychedelic midwife can help with integrating this transpersonal shift into parenthood, something that would be incredibly beneficial for the first year of life, especially in cases of cesarean section where that attachment process hasn't been completed. And if we can afford normal rights to, or sorry, if we can afford birth rights to these normal types of births, I began wondering if we could also consider bringing abortion rights into this as well, and to maybe start inviting a healing process for the woman and the mother, instead of adding on these unnecessary additional layers of trauma when they already know the gravity of the situation that they're in. So instead of winding up the trauma surgeon I thought I was supposed to be, I landed at this project I'm calling Theological. It's a praxis that aims to remove trauma from the body and society, not just surgically, but also, well, through transpersonal experiences, which kind of acts like a shamanic surgery in a way. And my wondering landed me here, asking how the world might be different if we not only allowed access to psychedelic therapy, but also use these as tools to repair the broken social structures that perpetuate trauma. So this gets into our last little part here about post-Renaissance paradigms, and wondering what other paradigms I can conceive of to create this future I envision, because the Renaissance doesn't work for me. For me, the Renaissance framing is over. It served its purpose. I'm ready to move on. And there are other scholars beginning to consider this. I invite you all to join us in this process, to consider instead a psychedelic revival that is more inclusive, more global, and not only serving a Renaissance framework which benefits only a few. And for me, this is an invitation for a restoration as well. So as you reclaim your psychedelic revival, you get to write your own story. And I like to bring up the story of LSD as an example for this. So what's your favorite part of LSD's story? For many people, it's Hoffman's discovery that matters most, and the bicycle ride that happened and the legend around that. And also, what about how Susie Ramstein was biking behind him, how she was supporting his rebirth process, how she was nurturing his transpersonal distress in his most vulnerable moments? To me, that's a more exciting story. Or maybe we start by telling the story of LSD, beginning with how ergot was of interest only because it had been used safely for centuries to induce childbirth. I mean, there's this whole other arm to all of it that we're missing. And the point is that birth stories never start with us. They are not a single point in time. They are snapshots held in community and social structures, part of a massive cosmic web that goes all the way back to that creatrix that I met. And this is the final point here, that when we live in reciprocity and we support women's bodily autonomy and cognitive liberty, and when we advocate for the right to restructure our society in accordance with these laws of nature and think about birth rights as rites of passage, then I think we will have achieved a post-Renaissance paradigm that can repair the harms the Renaissance left upon the womb. And I think that psychedelic midwives will play a very critical role in birthing this future. Thank you.
Great job, Katie. Thank you so much for sharing. Any questions or comments?
I'll jump in. I thank you so much, Katie. That was amazing, and I feel a little bit inappropriate as a man going first on this topic. But I also to say anything about this topic it feels a bit awkward, to be honest. But I just want to say that from my close female friends and family members who have had trauma through childbirth, or have worked with children who have died and have benefited significantly from psychedelics in ceremonial work or psychedelic therapy, I think there's a huge role, a huge opportunity there. So I think you're really onto something. I think this is a super important work, and I like some of the framing that you've used and the terminology as well.
Thank you so much. And I love that your child is there with you. I can't tell who this person is, but I'm grateful to have children involved here. This is great.
Yeah, this is my son, Rowan. My wife is off to do a jump in the ocean, and I told her I was in a conference, but I thought, well, I don't know, maybe it'll be okay. The timing sometimes isn't great,
absolutely.
but the timing seems perfect right now, actually.
Fully. And that's the whole point, right? Is that we're all part of a birthing community. I mean, I get so confused when people say, I don't like children. And I'm just like, what? You're part of a neighborhood. You're part of a society. You were a child yourself. My gosh, I just have no patience for it. So I'm grateful to have kids present. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that that's a good note. Also to ourselves that this panel is, or the judging panel is mostly men, and we should do more to change that. Of course, that's more systemic. But if anybody wants to give any more comments or feedback or just questions or just shower Katie with compliments, please do.
Feedback is good.
Yes.
Katie, I wonder what you think of Stan Groff's view, that 4-stage view of birth that he has.
The which view?
The four stages of birth.
The basic perinatal matrices,
Yeah.
right. I love it. I think it's a fantastic framework to start unpacking a lot of psychedelic experiences. And one thing I particularly like about it is that it's not as commonly talked about among my peers within psychedelic research. Stan Groff, I mean, his work within transpersonal psychology is very important for what I do at CIIS. But when I get into some of the other conversations with peers, there's kind of a confusion about what basic perinatal matrices were about and where that's coming from. And I'm wondering, as I'm aging and getting a little older and now looking at wanting to have children of my own, that's been part of the reframing as well, is learning to think of birth in this very different way and relating to it differently. And as I've done that, Groff's work just becomes so much more clear and so much more illuminated as I'm maturing. And that's been really fun.
And there's a whole field of pre and perinatal psychology that a lot of people don't know about, but it's developed pretty well.
Yeah. And when we can start to, in a post-Renaissance framework, when the prohibition's over and we're actually doing these types of studies, I really look forward to women leading and participating actively in that type of research, to where it's more community-oriented stuff, and it's participatory action processes that are coming from it, as opposed to just being the scholars who are in academia. I want women to be leading these studies themselves. So that'll be a fun future.
All right. Now moving on, home stretch. I'm sorry, I didn't include a break here, and I realized that it's a long session. So I hope you guys have been enjoying it so far. And last but not certainly least is Catherine Lyman.
Hello, everybody. Let me share my screen. All right. So I am a medical student at Stanford, and I'm preparing to go into psychiatry residency starting this summer. And I've been working on some research for the past several years, which I'm going to talk about today. And this is a study that I call the Psychosis and Spirituality Study. And so but before I dive into it, I want to share a little story about a made-up person, this lady here, who I've named Susan. So the type of research that I've done involves doing in-depth interviews with people about the most personal, transformative moments of their lives. And so it's difficult to share individual stories because these are stories that should be held privately. But Susan represents kind of a pattern that, kind of an amalgamation of the types of stories that I've heard through my research. So Susan is a 28-year-old woman who lives in Kentucky. And she grew up in a Christian family. Here you see her with her parents. Her parents are very religious and took her to church every Sunday. And in particular, a big part of their religious life was that they would, Susan was taught to pray at a young age, and she was taught that when she prayed, God would talk back to her. And both of her parents told her, this will happen sometimes in a literal way, where you might actually hear a voice in your head and God might speak to you and tell you what you need to know in your life, and will help you to build your faith. And so both of her parents said that they heard the voice of God sometimes, and Susan also started to hear it when she was young and as a teenager. It wouldn't happen all the time, but from time to time she'd hear this comforting voice, a voice that she came to recognize. So Susan grew up and went to college, and she became an accountant, and she continued her religious life. And when she was about 24 years old, she noticed that her prayers started to change a little. So God started to talk back to her much more frequently and much more at length. So after she'd pray, the voice of God might speak to her for about an hour and would tell her a lot of stuff. Not just these comforting expressions of love, but maybe telling her in detail how the world works, kind of the secrets of the world, and would also tell her lots of stuff about her peers and her and how people might be talking about her behind her back. And it started to get kind of scary sometimes. And sometimes a little bit, it would make her a little bit sad, some of the things she'd hear in these long talks. And with time, she started to hear other voices too, 5 or 6 different voices, and they would speak to her all day long. And Susan started to think maybe some of them were angels or different people in heaven. And the voices became more and more negative and started to make her feel like she was a bad person and like she was going to go to hell. And it just started to become a really negative experience for her. And then eventually Susan's roommate noticed that Susan hadn't eaten in several days and she didn't seem like herself. And the roommate became concerned and decided to take Susan to the hospital. So at this point, Susan ended up getting some treatment and ultimately ended up with the diagnosis of schizophrenia. And, you know, luckily for Susan, she had a great treatment team with good therapists and good medication. And with time, all these voices went away. And she was able to get some insight into what was happening to her. And she realized she's been diagnosed with this label of schizophrenia. And she thought, you know, I acknowledge that sometimes I might hear voices which aren't a reflection of the physical world around me. And I know that my brain will do that. And so she kind of accepted that about herself. But then she's left with this dilemma. What about that voice that I always heard as a child and as a teenager and in my early adulthood, which was the voice of God, which was a really foundational part of how I developed my faith and my worldview. And what do I make of that voice? And I feel like my talk here is kind of building on some of the things Alex was talking about earlier in terms of these foundational frameworks that are really important for people. And how do, in this particular study that I'm doing, how do some of these frameworks maybe collide? And so, you know, Susan has this dilemma about what she's supposed to make of all of her unusual experiences that she's had. So my study is looking at this question. You know, there are many people who've experienced altered states of consciousness, some through psychedelics, some because they have psychosis as part of schizophrenia or as part of bipolar, other conditions as well. And some people who are part of religious traditions where you might seek out altered experiences of reality. And when people have these unusual experiences, it's up to the person themselves to define what's going on with them and to decide if they consider it to be part of a pathological process or something that's kind of normative or something that's a healthy part of their lives. For this study, I was specifically looking for people who felt that they had some pathological experiences at some point in their life, but they'd also had experiences which were not pathological and which they considered to be spiritual experiences. So I was looking for people who said they'd had both, and I was asking them, what's the difference between those two things for you? And the definitions here specifically are psychosis. I defined it as something within the context of mental illness. So the word illness is key, like something that you see as pathological, something that your brain is creating, which ideally would not be there. And then a spiritual experience is also an abnormal experience of reality, but within the context of a spiritual or religious practice or process. So I think this is a really relevant question because many people have these two experiences and it can be very confusing to decide how you want to place labels on it for your own life and to decide which experiences you want to integrate as a core part of you and which experiences you want to disregard as something that, you know, maybe like a random creation of my brain, which is actually really harming me. So it's important how people decide to place these labels. I conducted a lot of interviews and uploaded some of the transcripts to a word cloud generator. And you can see the most central word here is the word voices. Voices can be a really key part of both of these experiences. And that just is kind of evidence of how confusing this can all be if you're hearing voices and don't know what kind of voices they are. And then how does this relate to psychedelics? Obviously, psychedelics also produce an altered state of consciousness. And it's important to think about what kind of altered state of consciousness is this, and how are we going to define it, and how are we going to discuss it? And in my research, I think there are some foundational questions which are all relevant to how we use psychedelics. Is there actually a difference between the two states of the psychosis state and the spiritual experience state? Is there something that's kind of universal there, or is it something that is kind of culture dependent? Are both of the states desirable? Should one be avoided? And does any of this influence precautions we might develop around psychedelic use? So, psychedelics, while we've found that psychedelics don't create mental illness, we do know that psychedelics can unmask a propensity for psychosis. And so for many people, their first psychotic break can happen after using psychedelics. And so it is important to talk about the different kinds of mental experiences that you may have after using psychedelics, and to kind of explore what is actually the difference between these different kinds of outcomes that we talk about. So what I did in this study is, as I mentioned before, the exclusion and inclusion criteria were really just finding people who'd experienced these two different states and who identified them as two different states. And I did semi-structured interviews with each of these people. And I asked them basically 3 questions to tell me in depth about your spiritual life and spiritual experiences that you've had, and then to talk in depth about your psychosis. And then finally, what's the difference between these two states for you? And I also used many scales to help assess the differences between them. One example here is the Fecal Quantifying Consciousness Scale. It actually assesses 26 different factors of consciousness, categories like how strong is your memory, how strong is your emotional response, is it logical, is it very visual, just so many details of how someone's experiencing an altered state. It really gives you a lot of data about what's going on within those two states. I interviewed people from several different countries, multiple gender identities, many different diagnoses, and religious and spiritual groups. And then there's a diversity here of the types of spiritual experiences that people are having. So some of these pictures I've included on this slide show you some examples. Here's a woman praying, and a lot of people just reported strong experiences with prayer and getting answers to prayer. This seems like a cliche picture. Some people practice magic and would talk about the role of animals in their magical experiences. These are people in church. So a lot of people talked about kind of these group communal religious experiences that were important to them. A Ouija board was important for some of my subjects. Here is in the same lines as the Ouija board, some people talked about seeing spirits or seeing ghosts. So just many different kinds of spiritual experiences. Sorry, it's frozen here. There we go. So I, after interviewing people, I asked them to talk about their spiritual experiences and about their psychosis, and ultimately asking them, what's the difference between these two things? Why do you draw a line between them? And why do you put one in this pathological category and the other in the other category? So I found 7 main methods that people used, and some of my subjects used more than one of these methods, but these are just themes that came out. So the most common method is this emotional one. So this is pretty intuitive. People talked about how their spiritual experiences were euphoric and blissful, and they felt a complete peace during their spiritual experiences. Whereas during their psychosis, they tended to be more emotionally negative. They felt really discouraged and shameful and afraid. So about 50% of my subjects talked about being in the emotional group. and notably only 50%, right? So this isn't just psychosis equals bad, spiritual experience equals good, because for the other 50% of people, that wasn't necessarily the case. You might really enjoy your time during psychosis, but yet still they would consider it to be a pathological process for other reasons. Some of the other schemas that people use, so this group I called the Orthodox group. So these are people who are part of a religious group or who have a strong set of spiritual beliefs or values. And ultimately how they're evaluating their experiences is asking themselves, is this consistent with my religious beliefs? So let's say an angel came to me and told me to stop praying and told me to never pray ever again. So I might go to the Bible and the Bible says that prayer is really important. So I think maybe that wasn't a real angel after all. Like I'll use my Orthodox beliefs here to decide that wasn't a real angel. That wasn't a true spiritual experience. I think that was psychosis. I think that was my brain making up something that's not really how I don't believe that to be a real spiritual experience. There's the reality validation group. So these people will look for real life correlations and real life outcomes, and they see their spiritual experiences as things that should be very consistent with reality. So if someone hears a voice telling them, run right now, go check on your baby. And so they run and they go check on their baby and they find the baby's choking and they're able to save their baby. This would be backed up by a real life outcome. So the voice that they hear, they're likely to say, I think that was a real spiritual experience. I think I was actually in touch with something real there, versus a voice that might tell them nonsensical things, things that don't play out, things that are completely inconsistent with reality. And for the sake of time, I won't go through the rest of these groups right now, but they're all, and these were endorsed by fewer people, but they're all interesting perspectives on what is the difference between these two types of unusual experiences. So just a few quotes here to illustrate these groups. Here, this is a woman who talks about the Orthodox method, and she was able to get treatment for her psychosis. And so her psychosis voices went away, but she continued to hear what she called spiritual voices. And she says, my spiritual voices go along with the teachings of Jesus better. It's not so random. The voices now remind me to pay my tithing, so payments to her church. Here's someone talking about the reality validation method. And he's specifically talking about how an experience is real if other people can understand it as well. And that's really his reality check that he uses. So he says, you can connect spiritual experiences to the experiences of other people. It's not that you're mad, you're rationally sensing a deeper sense of being. And then this person is talking about the emotional method. She says, the feelings that come with bipolar for me have been so negative and disturbing that I find it easy to see the difference between the two. And again, this association of psychosis as being negative and bad is not a universal one, but it is one that many people hold. So, for the sake of time today, I can't talk about the rest of the data that we've gathered, but there are many interesting patterns that I've found. Do people from different religious backgrounds tend to use different methods? The answer is yes. I found some patterns thus far. For example, the majority of my Catholic participants talked about using the Orthodox method. So, there's really strong emphasis on looking back on the liturgy of the church and seeing, does this match? And I imagine different patterns might emerge as I interview more people. And then the scales that I've used have also revealed some interesting patterns. Here's just one example. So this graph is measuring the element of mysticism, which is present in psychosis as well as in spiritual experiences. And here mysticism is talking about kind of the mystical, untouchable, unquantifiable aspect of an altered experience, the one that feels like you're getting in touch with something outside of words, outside of definitions. And as you can see, these are three different categories of mysticism. And there's plenty of it in both psychosis and spiritual experiences. The green is spiritual experiences, the orange is psychosis, and people have plenty of mysticism in both. although a little bit more in spiritual experiences. So I think that's pretty interesting. So now bringing this back into the world of psychedelics, some of the questions that I introduced at the beginning, is there actually a difference between these two states? So like lots of people will kind of challenge the model that we use in psychiatry of placing this illness label on psychosis and saying it's all a continuum, it's all kind of a mystical state that you can get into. And, you know, for many people who I spoke to screen them for this project, that was their experience, is that there wasn't much of a line between psychosis and spiritual experiences. But then there were many people who did have very different experiences of those two different things. And those are the people who I ended up recruiting for this project. So yeah, I think there can be like there can be a really solid difference between the two states. And I've talked about how people perceive that difference. Psychiatrists, when they're trying to differentiate between these two states, we'll usually talk about functionality. So is this experience working in your life? Is it allowing you to do the things you need to do as a person? Is it allowing your family to do what they need to do? If so, then maybe we don't need to treat it as an illness. But if it is causing dysfunction, then that should be something that we take care of. The questions are, both of these states desirable? Should one be avoided? Most of my subjects said very strongly that they would rather avoid the psychosis states, although not everybody. Some people considered psychosis to be an important part of their overall growth as a person. And then how does this influence precautions we develop around psychedelic use? I think the main message I want to leave you all with is that it's important to have these kinds of conversations with people, to talk about how are you experiencing these altered states of consciousness? What do you expect out of these altered states? And are there some things that are okay with you and some things that aren't? And really empower people to form their own rules of discernment, like I asked people to do in this study. I think that's a really important process for people to go through, to be able to classify the experiences that they have and to know how to make sense of them and incorporate them into their life story. So that's the end of my talk, and I'll open up to questions.
So we have time for like one or two more questions or comments. And then as a reminder, the judges are asked to go to this specific Zoom link to deliberate on who the finalists are, who the winners are.
I have the feeling, I don't know whether this would be worthwhile or not, having, say, two of these people get together and talk to each other. I think you might get insights and questions and things to ask that they would ask each other, like, did you see this? Did you feel this? That kind of thing.
Oh yeah, that's an interesting idea. That would be a fun discussion to have. Yeah, and from the people I interviewed, some of them had these constructs like already very well articulated before meeting with me, but then others kind of figured these things out during the process of the interview and figured out how to articulate them. So I think bringing people together in a group setting would just like further change how people are constructing these, and yeah, probably in a positive way. I think for most people, they'd appreciate being able to talk to others.
Also, during a psychedelic experience, which may last 10 hours, one might have experiences that are qualified as both. It'd be fascinating to know how they make that transition, or how that transition feels.
Yeah, and some of the people who I interviewed talked about psychedelics, not all, but for many of the people who I interviewed, that was part of their spiritual experience. And then some people talked about psychedelics as part of their psychosis experience, or as the thing that kind of kicked off their psychosis. Yeah, so it is interesting to hear those two states being accessed through psychedelics.
So yeah, this was great, and I think looking at the relationship between psychosis, the similarities and differences between psychosis and other states, mystical states, et cetera, induced by psychedelics, for example, is super interesting, as well as obviously very practical. Both in terms of, should people with psychosis, for example, be taking these drugs at all, which I think many of us would say probably not. And then on top of that, we all know a bunch of people who have done too many psychedelics, and even if they're not, you know, quite psychotic, they're probably not coming back from getting how, you know, being weird. And so, but I guess I was kind of interested in you had like a reality monitoring type, that's not the exact word you used, type construct there. And I was a little bit, I'm a little bit uncertain, because even if it's a spiritual experience, and some people will interpret that as real, you know, most of us would say it's probably not real. Like, you know, just because you know, the angel told you to listen to your baby, and it turns out your baby's actually crying, that's probably a coincidence. You know, in most cases, that's a coincidence. Or maybe you even heard the baby at some point and just didn't realize it. So I guess, how do you really, how do you determine like what's reality, in a way that it just sounds a little bit like, was this a good thing that I interpreted as being a good thing, or was it a bad thing? Like, I don't know what the difference is between reality monitoring for psychosis versus for psychotic episodes versus like a spiritual experience.
Yeah, so I think you're getting at something which I didn't go into, but for people in the reality validation group, I think these are people who tend to have spiritual experiences which are not departing very much from everyday reality. Or, you know, maybe it will in a way, like maybe you're hearing a voice in your head telling you, giving you specific directions, or you're getting like a hunch or an intuition to do something, and it ends up really paying out well. But it's not like a drastically transformed experience of consciousness. And so, and like the scales that I've done have backed this up too. So people in the reality validation group, they just tend to have less altered states of consciousness in their spiritual state. So for them, yeah, that is the big difference between their spiritual experiences and their psychosis, is that their spiritual experiences tend to check out pretty easily, and other people will like back them up and say, oh yeah, that makes sense. Versus their psychosis tends to not be validated very well by the people around them. But yeah, and then like the specific example you bring up of the woman who maybe like, you know, goes and finds her baby, and you can say, well, that's probably a coincidence. You know, I think that's getting to something which was sort of my mantra during this whole study, which is I only care about how you're defining your experiences. So, you know, if someone says that that's their big spiritual experience, then that's their big spiritual experience. And, you know, it can be that way for many reasons. But yeah, I mean, I think you bring up an interesting point, which is like, depending on which group you're in, that says something about what psychosis means to you, and it says something about what spirituality means to you.
So I guess in some ways, the departure from reality is kind of what it's that measure is, and it's more of a kind of a graded thing where your sorry, this cat's distracting me. It almost seems like, yeah, it's graded where people with psychosis have a really far departure from reality versus people with spiritual experiences. So whereas some of those other some of those other differences, they almost seem qualitative, like qualitatively different, like completely different things in some ways. That almost just seems like a difference in magnitude almost in that case.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I think some of the groups out of my 7 groups, some of them are more quantitative or scalar. Like, you know, it's like, how much of this am I getting? That's going to determine the label that I'm placing on this. Versus others, like the emotional group, you know, a lot of people in the emotional group have very similar spiritual experiences and psychosis experiences in terms of what's going on and the scale of what's going on. It's just like one makes them happy and one makes them sad. And that's the only difference between them. So yeah, I think I totally agree with what you're saying.
Okay, guys, so just so we finish on time, if the judges could now click on that Zoom link, and we'll just give some updates in between and see you guys in 5 to 10 minutes.
Click where?
Victor should have sent a link, and I'll just resend just for the judges. There. So yeah, let's move on to the next thing. So People's Choice Award, we wanted to give this as a chance for all of the audience to get to pitch in. And that was based on the highest number of likes on a YouTube video. And we're happy to announce that the winner is Connor Flanagan. If you want to say a few words, Connor, on your embodied model hypothesis, I thought the talk was spectacular.
Thanks, Emily. I'm super happy. I'm glad I got the likes. All the talks were amazing. I think I definitely shared and spammed it out there. So I'm glad that my friends were able to see it. And but yeah, all the talks were awesome. I was so grateful to be a part of the competition. And then, yeah, just if you haven't watched the talk, you can watch it. But the premise is it's pretty much an idea for why behavioral changes are so potent, but also so flexible across the spectrum of different kind of like things that we want to work on, whether that's emotional disorders, addiction, and across the whole spectrum. And then maybe do in the idea that I presented to the embodied model hypothesis, which is like tied to Renee Girard's ideas of mimetic theory, and basically talking about creating new models via the psychedelic experience that are kind of overpowering and can create this behavioral change, and substituting them for kind of harmful or traumatic models that can be the engines that are unfortunately powering a lot of emotional disorders or other things that we're trying to work on with psychedelics. So go watch the talk. I like it. Hopefully you like it. Some amount of people liked it. So, that's a sign. And
90 people.
90 people. That's a lot of people. That's that's like 3 elementary school classrooms just hitting my link on the YouTube button. But yeah, thanks everyone. All the talks were awesome, and I'm grateful to be a part of this awesome community.
Thank you, Connor.
So yeah, I guess next up, this will be really quick, but just wanted to thank all of the panelists and Aylin who did the opening act, as well as the Psychedelics team in particular. You guys have done so much work. I've been at the front line, so I see like everything you guys do. And it's, we see like a week right now, like a few panels and this like final event, but it's been like months of like planning. And I hope like, the goal of this was to help people like figure out what they want to do if they're interested in psychedelics, and like learn about like new ideas and like new careers. And that was, our process and our goal in this whole week. So we hope you like enjoyed something with regards to the academic panels, psychotherapy panels, industry, if you want to be a grad student. So yeah, that was a ton of work. Happy to receive any feedback or comments, but I hope you guys learned something and found the experience enjoyable.
And everything will live on YouTube. So we can continue to share this and people can come back to it anytime for all of eternity. So that's great.
For free. Yeah, so that is that. So again, huge thank you to panelists and Psychedelics team. Just so for transparency, I guess this is retroactively, but we had 21 talks. We had the top 6 picked, 3 undergrad and grad, and those were based on a rubric based on clarity, timing, how concise they were, their use of graphics, the impact score, like their novelty, their relationship like to the talk, like how much of this like was individual and was straight from their perspective. So it was a huge combinatorial score, and like the Psychedelics team pretty much like took all of those talks and graded them. And yeah, we picked the top 6 total, and that's how it was done. So that's just a quick note on that. And yeah, now we just have some free time, I guess, until they're ready to announce the Psychedelics winners. But of course, everyone who participated is a winner. And I hope you guys received a lot of good feedback, good questions. Definitely want to extend the Q&A a little bit more next time, since that's a lot of where like the fun happens. So if you guys have ideas for that, maybe we can extend it on the IPN Discord or something. Yeah, let us know.
Hello. We're back with results.
Yeah, so I just asked the judges, actually, one of the judges to announce if possible.
You can do it, Victor.
I vote for Minaj.
Oh.
I guess since Victor just sent me.
Okay.
Yeah, you got all the results, Victor, so you should maybe do it.
Yeah. Sure, 1 second.
In the meantime, we announced while you guys were away that Connor Flanagan has won the People's Choice Award based on votes on the YouTube videos that we posted. So he's here in the meeting just to pop in and say hi.
Awesome. Connor?
Oh,
So Victor, are we going to do a drum roll or what? Do you got
Yes.
any sound effects or anything?
Yes, I just felt bad. I was trying to like get all the participants' last names so I could say them as well, but I'll just stick to the first names then, because I'm having a hard time pulling them all up. So starting with undergrads first. First place is Andrew. Second place is Caitlin. Third place is Sophia. And that is our undergrad winners for Psychedelics 2021. Great job to all of them for their presentations, creativity, and delivery. Moving on to the graduate student presenters. All right. First place goes to Catherine. Second place goes to Katie. And third place goes to Alex. Once again, thank you guys so much for your presentations, all the effort you guys put into these presentations, the creativity, ingenuity, delivery. We're very grateful to have had you guys christen Psychedelics 2021 with them. And thank you to all our judges who gave up a huge amount of their Saturday afternoon to come here and judge these presentations and provide feedback. So really appreciate that. And I'm sure all the presenters do as well.
Thank you all so much. Have a great rest of your Saturday, and thanks for sticking through the little technical difficulties.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks,
All right,
everyone.
thank you.
Great talks. Thank you. Bye.
Congrats, well done. Thank you.